green light on it. I will start the recording.
Okay, great. Yeah. I just saw everyone's all.
Oh, yes, I guess there's that one too. Is there any, are there just two? Okay.
Yeah, sure. We'll just pass it around. So I just want to thank Michael for coming in here today. This is a great treat for us. I think we've had a really good time with all of our guest lecturers, but Michael, if he hasn't told you, basically none of us would be here right now if it wasn't for him, because he was instrumental.
That sounds very odd, but yeah.
He was instrumental in putting together Jonathan Strand's policy. So his experience in administration is unsurpassed here at the university, and I know we're going to learn a lot from him about all kinds of working with groups and change management, which he's done a lot of
Right.
years.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, everybody. Jen's right. I certainly had been involved in academic administration for quite a while. So while I have spent 40 plus years as a university professor, a large portion of that time was spent in one administrative role or another. And the administrative role I want to talk to you about today is the Provost of the University of Saskatchewan, a job that I came here to do. I was recruited to come here to take on that role. And I was in that role for 10 years, from 1997 till 2007. And then I went back in 2016 for a year, 2016-2017, to fill in while the university was recruiting a new provost. And I have often reflected that while I was the provost and vice president academic, that was my official title, and it remains the official title of the person in the job right now. My academic exposure during that period was relatively modest. I did teach a couple of classes, but I did a tiny bit of research, but not much. I really had to put all of that on hold. And I tell you that because I often reflected during those years that while I was the provost and vice president academic at the University of Saskatchewan, the role I was playing was not unlike a lot of other senior executive roles in a lot of other organizations. And in the course of my time in that job, I got to meet people who were the CEOs of Crown corporations, the CEOs of private companies, and really the job, our jobs, our leadership kind of role wasn't that fundamentally different. And I sometimes wished I could be the CEO of SaskTel or something like that, and that person could take my job for a while. But in a way, especially on the public sector side, where you have relatively independent agencies, the roles aren't that fundamentally different. Obviously, the clientele is different. The missions are going to be different. Some of the interactions and the people you meet are going to be different. But the leadership qualities that are required to be successful in these jobs, I don't think are fundamentally different. Now, having said that, I don't pretend to know quite what those qualities are. And while I haven't shared this view with Jen, and she'll may have a different take on it, the literature on leadership that you read, some of which is very popular, and you can pick up in airports or on newsstands and so on, and others purport at least to be quite academically oriented. Generally speaking, it's my feeling that this literature is not as strong as other parts of, say, your program in general. And part of it has to do with it's very hard to wrap your arms around what leadership consists of, and you'll know that by now if you've read anything. Particularly hard to know what good leadership consists of. And frankly, what ethical leadership consists of. So if you leave this course uncertain about any of those topics, I don't think it's a failure or anything. I mean, This is an open-ended kind of growing experience for all of us. When I took on the job, my first administrative job, I wasn't sure at all what it entailed. And I found out one thing: it entailed a lot of learning. And I had a lot of rapid learning to do in order to be able to even talk to the people that I was working with or that I was responsible for. But along the way, I probably have learned some lessons of leadership, but I certainly wouldn't go so far as to say, like, I know I can give you a definition of leadership, good leadership, or ethical leadership off the top of my head anyway. What I want to talk to you today about instead is what Jen has indicated, namely some of the experiences I had in leading change at this institution. And again, I think that what my experience here is transportable. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that don't read what I have to say as somehow confined exclusively to universities or to the University of Saskatchewan or to this particular period or anything like that. Because I think that what I learned, what I took away from my experience actually is quite transportable into other realms and other circumstances. So in the period that I was the provost and vice president, I should just mention a little bit about what that job is. So the provost really is the chief kind of academic officer of the university and also the chief budgetary officer. So there is a vice president of finance who is responsible really for the financial health of the university. And that means all of the assets that we have, human and physical. And that person is responsible for making sure that we are properly invested, properly insured, that we are managing risks properly, and so on, as a big, complex organization. But the vice president academic, the provost and vice president academic, is responsible and works obviously with that person closely, but is also responsible for the allocation of resources within the university. And not just to the academic units like the colleges, but also to the other units out there that are supporting all of our activities. That includes, of course, the student units and the financial management, human resources, everything. They all are resourced. They all have budgetary needs, and the provost actually is really responsible for the allocation of those resources. And, of course, the reallocation should those be necessary. And they have been necessary over a period of time. Also the organization, generally speaking. And in the course of time that I was here, we made a lot of changes. And so I want to talk to you about some of the lessons, but I will just mention some of the changes that we made and some of the activities we undertook. One of them was to review all of our academic programs, every single one of them, from the Bachelor of Science in Agriculture to the Bachelor of Arts in Drama and so on, everything that we do had to go under a kind of microscopic review. So that was a very big undertaking. I was responsible for and did change the standards here for tenure and promotion. So the entire set of criteria that are employed in determining who gets tenure, who gets promoted, and so on, those all had to be fundamentally changed. At least I thought they did. I was also responsible for, and I undertook to identify a set of priorities that we would, on the academic side, that we would finance and provide extra resources to in order to move this institution forward. There were organizational changes. We put together various parts of the student services. There were various portfolios, student services portfolios. We put them all together in what was then called Student Enrollment Services Division, and has now got a different name, but it's basically the same thing. One big student organization with one principal person in charge. And that person right now is called the Vice Provost of Students, something or other. Patty McDougall is the person in the job. We created, as Jen indicated, not just this interdisciplinary school, but two others at the same time. We had to do an awful lot of work with the health sciences, and I can talk to you a little bit about that if you're interested. We changed a lot of our processes. We introduced an entire set of planning processes that the university had never really experienced before. We created multi-year budget formats and also a financial, what I called at the time an academic priorities fund, which we didn't have before. So those are just some of the changes that we made. And so what I want to talk to you about are basically 7 kind of lessons that I would take away from the changes that we made. And I'm going to be quite frank with you in terms of assessment, right? So, be careful if you want to repeat any of this to somebody. Just be cautious about what you're saying and what you're attributing to me. So I'm going to be quite candid with you. So first of all, and this won't surprise you, but all of the changes that we made were driven by a clear vision of what the University of Saskatchewan had to become. And that was essentially to restore the University of Saskatchewan to a position of prominence within Canadian higher education. And that implies, and if you've already figured that out, that we had lost that position. And it wasn't obvious to everybody on this campus in particular that we had lost this position, but it was pretty much clear to the rest of the higher education world in Canada that the University of Saskatchewan had kind of slipped out of the top tier of research universities.
Michael, sorry, when did that happen, do you think?
Well, it would have happened over a relatively long period of time. I mean, the university had sort of glory days in particular areas in the 1940s and 50s in physics, for example, and in cancer treatment. It also had in the 50s and 60s a high-quality law school and high-quality programs in the social sciences, and had and continued to have all the way through this period some certain strong programs in computer science and elsewhere. But it had, and I've reflected on this, Jen, often. What was it that sort of transformed the institution or allowed us to decide that, well, we were kind of good enough? And I think that what happened was that not much changed at the University of Saskatchewan. Not much was invested in active thinking about the future and what we needed to do. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was changing very rapidly. And we were not paying attention to those changes. And by the rest of the world, I mean the rest of Canada, but also literally the rest of the world. So that's not a particularly satisfactory answer, but
no, that gives me some sense of the time frame.
Yeah, the time frame is so relatively long period of time.
Yeah.
Now, so to restore the University of Saskatchewan meant for us more research, more graduate students, a commitment to a quality educational experience, and identification of areas in which we would be preeminent, and by implication, areas in which we would not be. And then after a time, we would join this elite club, or rejoin the elite club of research-intensive universities in Canada. So I thought this was I had come from McMaster, I thought this was a pretty uncontroversial kind of vision, but I was wrong about that. And so a warning to those of you who go into organizations for the first time, especially in a leadership role, and you talk to your colleagues and you talk about what it is and what your hopes are for the institution or for the organization, don't assume that the handful of people that you're speaking with and interacting with on a regular basis represent all of the opinion there is. So there were some people at the University of Saskatchewan when I came that actually disparaged research, really, and wanted the U of S to be a great undergraduate teaching school, full stop. And that, by the way, explains why, and the light went on for me, why most of the innovations that had occurred in the previous 20 years were at the undergraduate level. So there was very little investment in that vision I'm talking about around graduate work and research. Some people believe that there was really nothing that we needed to restore, that we were really already great, that we were heroes in our own minds. That normally would have been difficult to persuade people about, except that about the same time as we started on this venture, the federal government decided it was going to create what was called a Canada Research Chairs program, and you'll be familiar with those. We have some Canada Research Chairs in this school. But the important thing was that it was going to allocate Canada Research Chairs, which there were, like, I can't remember, like 1,000, I think, that were going to be allocated according to, in effect, the research intensiveness of the institutions as measured by successful applications to the granting councils, the National Research Granting Councils. So this suddenly is everybody now knows across the country what allocation goes where. How many of these research chairs go to McGill? How many go to UBC? How many go to the University of Manitoba? And of course, how many come to the University of Saskatchewan? And our initial allocation of 33 of these chairs out of the 1,000 was well below what a lot of people expected we would get. And certainly below what other institutions of a similar size and history were getting. So the university I came from, McMaster, got about 68 of those Canada Research Chairs. This university got 33. And that was a big wake-up call, and in a way, did me a great favor. I mean, I didn't like to see those numbers, but I didn't produce them. And I needed talking points like this to try to persuade those people who thought, hey, you know, what's the problem? There is no problem. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Well, it looked to me pretty broke if your aspiration really was to be in the league with these top research institutions. Some people thought that it was good to try to do this, but we weren't really going to be able to do it. We just weren't up to it. We didn't have what it takes. We're in a poor province. Good idea, Mike, but we'll never do it. We'll never make it. And some others, chiefly in government, and not incorrectly, by the way, thought it was going to be too expensive. And inside the university, I was often told that I was really not supposed to try anything new until I could find the resources to adequately fund and support what we already had. So this links up to, like, what we've got is good. The problem is we just don't have enough resources to support it. So people would say to me, you want to do new stuff, but you have your main job, your first job is to resource all the stuff we're already doing that isn't resourced well enough, okay?
That, in my experience, seems to be a common reaction by people who are on the inside already.
Yes.
We just need more. We just need more resources.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So government, from their perspective, from the outside, if you like, was all for change, right? They were all good for getting rid of some things, adding new things, and so on. But they were worried that it was going to be too expensive. Inside, the attitude took the form you're just speaking about. So I tell you all this not to discourage you, but to say to you, to go back to my vision point, we would never have charted an aggressive agenda like this, and we would never have made serious progress without inspired leadership, vision, and conviction. And there were times when I wondered if we were really going to move this, if it was really going to happen. More about leadership later, but on vision. It's easy to disparage vision, and you know, I remember George H.W. Bush talking about the vision thing. You won't remember it, but he used to, when people challenged the President of the United States to talk about a vision for the United States, he used to say, I just don't like that vision thing. And that's fine. But you watched the 2016 presidential campaign in the United States, and you saw that if you're a Bernie Sanders, you may not have an awful lot in the way of personal charisma, although I think Bernie Sanders has some charisma. You don't necessarily have to have had a lot of executive experience, and I think Bernie Sanders had hardly any executive experience. But he did have a vision for the United States and for the people of the United States. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, she struggled with the vision piece. And that translated into people not being sure why she wanted to be president other than for the greater glorification of Hillary Clinton. And that, of course, as you all know, proved to be a real anvil that she had to drag around throughout the campaign in 2016. So vision matters. Leaders, people look to leaders to lift their sights above the here and now, above the mundane, above like getting to the end of the week or getting to the end of the term. Higher than that. Think about the institution or the organization over a longer period of time. And that's what we would not have made any progress, especially against the attitudes that I've just outlined, had we not had that kind of leadership at the very top. So, second point. And by the way, interrupt me at any time. Ask whatever questions you want. If there's something that you're curious about, just stop.
And I have the other recorder, so if you want to ask a question, just wave at me and I'll bring it to you. Okay.
So do that. My second point, change takes time. Cultural process changes take the longest time. And when I think about how we went about the change process over the 10 years I was in the job, we did start with program changes. So fairly specific things that needed fixing, that everybody agreed needed fixing. We had some departments that were desperately dysfunctional, some support units that nobody really had any time for. They just didn't think they were doing the job. They didn't think they were competent. They didn't think, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. You have said that you have brought a lot of changes in terms of leadership. You had vision, you did that.
No, I didn't say I had vision. I said there was a vision.
Yeah.
Okay.
And with all the changes that you brought into the university, do you think those were the characteristics that you had as a leader, or you think through training or experience you had those traits?
Well, I think I had, in nascent form, the qualities that were required to get us through this process. But that's because I made it, right? I mean, there's a lot of senior administrators whose careers end long before they imagine they're going to end. And so I think I can say with some confidence that it turned out that the qualities that were required at the time for this institution, I had them at least in this kind of undeveloped, naive form. I had come from a research-intensive university. That made a big difference. Of course, people looked at me quite suspicious because of that. I mean, I was told more than once that my real agenda was to turn the University of Saskatchewan into McMaster University. Things like that. But, so yeah, I mean, some of it had to do with me, but as I'm going to explain, it certainly wasn't just about me. I mean, I happened to be in a pivotal role, which gave me an opportunity to help make these changes, but that vision was not my vision. In the sense that, I mean, I signed on to it because I had, frankly, a bit of a romantic view of the University of Saskatchewan that I developed while living in other parts of the world. And I saw the University of Saskatchewan as a prominent player at the upper levels of higher education in Canada. And was frankly a bit startled when I came here to realize that that idea was at the very least out of date, and that some changes were going to be needed. But I don't, if your question is, was I uniquely cut out to help do this, I think I fit into the change agenda that other people were also articulating, principally the president of the university. And I'll talk about him later. But I did want to say that all of this change, which took place over 10 years, I had to be very patient. And I guess I realized after about year 3 that things were happening, but they were happening painfully slowly. And that I was probably going to have to sign on to another 5-year term to see if I was really going to be able to do what I had started to do, or be part of what we'd started to be part of. And the president at the time constantly worried about slippage. Every, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, or, even 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Meanwhile, as I said before, the rest of the world is moving very quickly. So cultural change takes time, and you have to be patient. It's not going to happen overnight. One speech isn't going to turn people around. A dozen studies of one kind or another, that's not going to either. People do have to become convinced themselves that the direction that you're going in is the direction they want to go in. And this is the kind of institution they want to be part of. And I often said in conversation with the president, with others, that's how we need to think about this. What kind of institution or organization or whatever do you want to be part of? Doing what kind of work? When I was coming over here, I listened to somebody on the radio talking about their immigration experience and praising Service Canada and the help that he got from Service Canada throughout a lengthy period. And and I thought to myself, you want to be part of an organization that people unbidden on the radio talking about their personal experiences pause long enough to say that organization was a huge help to me. I want to be part of an organization that is of a huge help to people. And so, but getting people to want that and to feel that's important to them, that takes quite a while. And also just getting them to understand that if you want to be part of an institution that is genuinely adding value, then you've got to make changes. It can't be the institution that our grandparents attended. It just can't be. So it takes time.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned...
Sorry. I know this makes it less spontaneous, but then the other students can hear.
Thank you. So you mentioned the resistance you have to face, especially when you were trying to change. So you think that was because people didn't understand that the vision has changed, or do you think that it was mostly because the term we use very often, that employer people resist change? So you think it was more that people didn't understand that vision has changed, or it is just a natural resistance to the change?
Well, I think they understood the vision that was being articulated. And for some of them, it was very welcome news. And their view was that, the university had neglected its core business for a long time and had lost any aspiration to be among the very best institutions in the country. So I think for a lot of people, they heard this and they thought, I like this. But where they struggled was what... goes back to what we said before. Really, what you should do is go and convince a whole bunch of other people that this is worthwhile, get us a bunch of money, and then give it to us, and we'll just do everything we're doing a lot better. And so, to get them to understand that it's one thing to sign on to the vision, but the rest of it, the whole pattern of implementation of change, identification of key points that need to change, and then the implementation of that change, that's all part of the package. You lose people along the way once they start to understand that it could affect them. I remember when we put together the various components of the student services operation, we did literally lose people. I mean, in the course of that year, some people decided, this is when I'm retiring, this is not for me, I can't find a place to fit inside this new organization. I'm going to start looking for another job. And in some cases, we couldn't find places for people. And we had to say, we just can't use your skills any longer. Because that's not the way, what you were doing, even if you were doing it very well, is no longer what we are going to be doing.
So what I understand, they didn't have a problem with the vision, they had a problem where they end up after the changes.
Naturally. Yeah, I say naturally. I mean, and I would just caution you to be aware that there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's a perfectly sensible reaction. I mean, people don't sign on to change unless they have some idea about how it's going to affect them. I did talk about change quite a bit. I tried to avoid language like the use of words like excellence, which was very much in vogue in the early part of the 2000s. Everything was going to be excellent. We were going to be excellent. Everybody's going to be excellent. We're going to have excellent programs. So I tried not to talk that kind of language, which means that means you have to talk a different kind of language, and avoid being too technocratic about it. But
can you explain what you mean by technocratic?
Well, let's say what we're going to do is we're going to change our budgeting system and introduce particular ways of allocating resources, and we're going to get unit leaders to make submissions of a particular kind and so on. I mean, we went through an exercise like that not too long ago at this university where everybody had to kind of defend and explain what they were doing and with the idea it was all going to be evaluated. And I tried to avoid that kind of, there is a technical solution to this. I have an instrument. I'm going to force you all to fill out forms, do whatever, and then at the end of it, we're going to know which way we're going to go, and who's going to come with us and who isn't. That just scares the hell out of people. And they worry that they're going to be subjected to a process that is far too mechanical and lacks a kind of judgment and frankly lacks a kind of sense of empathy and humanity. So if you wonder why leaders often seem to dwell on the vision part and aspirational part, it's partly because they know that if it's not their job really to talk about the instrumentalities and how we get from here to there. At least in my case, that was a bigger part of my job. I wanted the president to be the aspirational leader of the institution. And I remember I told him, I think he'd been in the job for a year and a half. Maybe, yeah, about a year and a half. I said to him, I need you to explain to the university where we're going. I can't do it. It's not my job, right? I mean, but you can. In fact, you have to. I can't do anything else. I can't make these various changes we all agree need to be made unless you explain personally where you're taking this institution. And I do recall Peter McKinnon, who's the president, saying to me, do I have to? Pretty much you see, do I have to do that? Because he knew it was risky. And he often said afterwards, you only get one chance to do this, so you got to get it right. You can't kind of a year and a half or 2 years later say, remember what I said back then? Actually, I want to have a do-over. I want to rethink that. That's like, you can't. So he knew it was risky, but I said we cannot move this unless you do that. And as it turned out, and I'm off my script here a little bit, but as it turned out, the vision that he articulated, and I gave you some of the high points and stuff, was one that we shared with a number of people and basically test drove. It was like, I didn't even think of it as a focus group kind of thing at the time, but it turned out to be kind of like that. Because by the time we were ready to do this, I knew there were pockets inside the institution of critical thinkers and people who were quite influential. And I wanted them, and kind of cautiously supportive. So I wanted to test drive the message with them and see how it, and they had ideas, and the message was shifted and adjusted because of that. So, not sure where I was going with that, but
I have a question, Michael.
Yep.
How long after your arrival here did you start to test drive the message?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I was 2 years here with one president, and then the new president comes. So by the time 2 years is up in a job like this one, you begin to understand what the challenges are. You begin to identify the kind of so-called low-hanging fruit, the things that, or put another way, the things you absolutely have to do right now, otherwise they're kind of an embarrassment. And there were also some things really getting me down. Like I was listening to complaints or to objections to things that just didn't strike me. I was told, for example, when I said, how many Indigenous students do we have at the University of Saskatchewan? Oh, we don't know. I said, well, given the demographics and given everything else and given the agenda, this is about 20 years ago. We need to figure out how, we can't do that. There's no way we can do that. So, this is one of those cases where no isn't, or no way, is not good enough. We may not have a way of doing that now. We've got to invent a way. And I don't expect you to do it next week or anything, but I need you to get on it. And we need to, there's software problems, and there's this problems, and then there's consent problems, and then what do we do with the information, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, right, we need policies. We need the technical part, how we gather the information, we need policies, we need all that stuff. Get moving, right? So I had encountered enough of that kind of what I'd call passive resistance in various quarters of the institution to know what required change. But it wasn't until we got a new president, a person I happened to, by that time I knew very well, and we had talked about the institution, where we were going with it, and so on. So it took me no time before a lot of the things we talked about we were starting to put into place. But I couldn't have done that with the old president, not because he was not in favor of that vision or anything like that, but he was in the last 2 years of a 10-year term, and he just wasn't up for what I talked about. I'm saying, it is going to be a long process, and he wasn't going to be around for a long time. And the day he left office, he literally got in his van and so on and drove to BC, and he has come back a couple of times, but he was gone from the scene. And that was good in a way, because it allowed us to do the things to kind of ramp up very quick. But it did take, you can't just go into a situation and begin to articulate a vision from the start. You have to kind of lay the groundwork. And even for Peter, as I say, it was 1.5 years before I put him up in front of the university community. And it was a big gathering. They'd never seen a president stand up and say, we got problems, but we got solutions. And that's what he did. And it was an amazing success, that particular statement. And we basically rode that statement and that vision the entire period of his presidency. That's what I mean about when he would say, we got to get it right the first time, because there's no do-over. So I've said things take time. What else? What do I want to say? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
What if you don't have time?
Yeah. Well, then you're not going to make a cultural change, right? Or you're not going to work with the people who are currently in the organization. If you need to make changes and you don't have a lot of time, even if you've got talented people who are in the organization, you will have to move them. You will have to put new people in key positions. And we certainly did quite a bit of that strategically. In some cases, deans. I told deans that their term was up, even if I had to tell them that I needed their resignation, because we weren't making progress the way we needed to. And oftentimes in those cases, there was a great deal of resistance within these colleges. But your question's a good one. If you don't have time, then and time to kind of nurture, who is it? One of the readings talks about the benefits of this kind of bottom-up synergy. And in universities, typically, they are slow movers. And so you've got to work with the opportunities that you have. And I'll probably say something about that after. But you've got to seize every opportunity to re-articulate and move that agenda forward among people who are not in positions of authority, but are in positions of influence. And the university is full of people like that. In fact, there are way more people who are influential than there are people who are in authority. And there are a lot of people in authority who aren't particularly influential. They happen to be in jobs, they happen to do jobs, but they're not really influencers. So finding those influencers and working with them to generate the kind of support and the kind of rethinking and articulation of where it is you want to go on specific issues. If you've got the time, that is the way to do it. If you don't, then I think you'll find yourself removing people and putting people in place who are mission-driven. That's not a very satisfactory answer. And I've never worked in an organization that has had to turn on a dime.
I can think about like the child welfare system, for example, that requires change and fairly quickly because children's lives are at risk.
Yeah.
But it's a massive bureaucracy with a very long history of a particular culture within that organization.
Right.
So when the government talks about the need to kind of reform that system, does it require them to fire everyone that works there?
No. In fact, you can't. I mean, what you'll see is there will be places within the organization that are critical, mission critical, and also failing. Mm-hmm. And so with relatively limited time, you do have to spend some of your resources on those problem areas. Mm-hmm. And this will be something you will have talked about before. A lot of would-be leaders end up spending a vast amount of their time basically managing by exception, right, or problem solving along the lines I just indicated, and neglecting the broader cultural change that is actually needed, and what you're seeing is the problem here is just an expression of this broader culture. And so good leaders, I think, empower people to make change on the local level and solve problems and deal with fallout, and devote more of their time, not to micromanaging and not to worrying about this all the time, but more of their time explaining to people where we need to go as an organization over the next 3 years, where we need to go over the next 5 years, where we're going to be as an organization. We're going to be reorganized, we're going to have fewer people, we're going to have more people, we're going to be dealing with a different clientele or the same clientele but better, whatever it is, all of that needs to be explained by leaders. And with an eye to the flashpoints. You can't just be unaware because typically those are the things you get asked about. And so you need to be prepped for those. But you can't obsess about those. I don't know why this keeps ringing. Well, I do know, but I'm just ignoring it. We failed on a number of fronts. Okay, so any changes and you're going to, if you change the child welfare system in this province or anywhere else, there will be failures. Things will happen that you didn't expect. That's fine. But even ideas you thought were terrific. We launched something called a virtual college of biotechnology. The previous president had actually announced that we were going to create a quote-unquote virtual college of biotechnology. So when I came, I said, George, what is that? And he said, I have no idea. But you have to figure it out. That's literally. So anyway, we did it. And it showed us a bunch of things. Like for somebody who's a political scientist, I didn't know what biotechnology was. It would have been useful if I had spent a little more time understanding it. But I do remember one time one of the associate deans in agriculture turned to me. This was like, we're now into a virtual college. He said to me, Mike, the problem with this whole idea is that everybody's doing biotechnology. Everybody, in biology and biochemistry and soil science, we're all doing biotechnology. This was maybe not my first, but certainly was another clue that, we probably didn't conceive of this particularly well. Because I don't think any of us really agreed, or any of the principals really agreed on what biotechnology was. And I spent most of my time trying to figure out what a virtual college was. Like, how would that work? And, I should have spent some time on what biotechnology was. And maybe that would have I could have kind of cut that one off at the pass. And anyway, we created it, and eventually we wound it up. We learned things from that, but I think on general it was a mistake. When I told you before, we reviewed all of the programs that we had, and that was another project that was underway before I got to the university, and I was happy to follow through because, like, what did I know about all these things? This was going to be a great way to find out where the strengths were and so on and so forth. The problem with it was that we put tons of resources into it. And when I say we, I don't just mean like the senior leadership. I mean all these people who had to have their programs reviewed. And then what? They said, for some of them, they said, well, I thought if we get a really good review, we'll get more resources and so on and so forth. And not an unreasonable expectation. So again, a lesson, if you're going to undertake a review of things, at the very least, have it in your own head what the outcomes of this review are going to be. It can't be just for your own satisfaction. And you cannot, if you're not going to reorganize or reallocate resources, or if you are, and I think I would have been up for reallocating, but I had no mechanisms to do that. All I had was literally like a stack of reviews of every program that we had. And I hadn't thought about what it was I was going to do with all of this. I mean, I did. It was good. I knew way more, and we all knew way more. But then what? So I don't consider it a failure, but I consider it, let's just say, a very partial success. I personally did not pay enough attention to the collective agreement with the faculty in particular. And so I made a mistake with respect to introducing new standards for tenure and promotion. I mentioned that before. So what should have taken 1 year took 3. And that was on me. Because, it was also on the agreement, which was extremely ambiguous with respect to the process you're supposed to use. But I left myself open to being accused of undermining or going around the process. Whereas, in fact, I just didn't take the time to figure out what a consensus process would look like. So again, we eventually succeeded, but I would have to chalk that up as certainly a lesson learned.
So, Michael, can I ask, at the time when when you first realized that something that you'd undertaken was only a partial success or a failure, how, in a leadership position, do you acknowledge that and keep going forward? How do you turn that into something that doesn't set you back in your career?
So I didn't. Like, take the last one. I didn't say to the faculty association, well, you guys are right and I'm wrong. But I did say to the deans and to others that I have gone about this the wrong way, And and so I admitted that. But I didn't leave it at that. I said, I think this is the right way to go, right? And I invited them to comment, so it was like everybody learning. Like, this is a whole trial and error is what this is about. You try things, you make some mistakes, you go back, you revise, and you keep going. The vision doesn't change. The standards were going to be a lot tougher. We were going to send some big signals. And it goes back to what I said about the nature of this university. Frankly, we didn't really have any standards for tenure and promotion. I'm mildly exaggerating when I say that really a faculty member once hired at the University of Saskatchewan only really had to kind of show up. And some people like to say have a pulse. And then eventually you'd get tenure, and after that it was you're on easy street. And that was an attitude that was prevailed. And I was like, not only was I kind of shocked at that, but I was appalled at that idea. And it's fine if you want to be an institution that is focused on something else. Actually, every institution needs standards of one kind or another, whatever their ambitions are, whatever they want to be. They need to focus on making sure that the people who are delivering that actually are delivering it. But anyway, it did take longer, and I did have to say to people, that I didn't get this right. In fact, there was a living testament to the mistake was because we printed what we thought were going to be the new standards. And I don't know how many of those we printed, maybe a couple of hundred, in nice glossy sheets. These are the new standards. Only, of course, with a date and everything. I don't think I ever kept a copy of those. But all those ended up being shredded because, no, those weren't going to be the new standards after all. And it was going to be quite a while before we were actually going to get the new standards.
So just to jump back into some of our readings, a number of the more popular readings, and even one of the theoretical ones, have talked about creating trust by, acknowledging your vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And that word vulnerability can set off kind of little alarms for me sometimes, because I imagine people weeping at meetings and stuff, which can be okay too. But I imagine you weren't doing that. I'm wondering if just this acknowledgement that we're all in a learning process together, which gives space for everyone to be somewhat fallible, even while they're doing their best, is that how you understand this?
Yeah, there's that. I mean, I think you can survive this learning process, if the steps you take are relatively. This is going to sound like incrementalism on steroids. I don't necessarily mean. The vision piece has to be a big step. That's big, risky. You got to do that. But there are a lot of other things. You can calibrate the steps and how big you're going to take. Sometimes you have no choice. It's either, you merge these organizations, create one, or you don't. You can't kind of fiddle at the edges. Other cases like, the library, you're used to going to that library and going to Starbucks and all those things. Well, imagine like 15 or 20 years ago, there was no such thing. In fact, I had people telling me that the world would end pretty much the day that we allowed food inside the precincts of the Murray Library. Because, there would be all kinds of very bad things that would happen, including vermin that would come and then eat the pages of books. And I tell you, and I listened to this kind of argument. So we learned that in order to persuade people who are of a, shall we say, a kind of traditionalist mindset with respect to libraries, that we had to go relatively slow. One of the things I wanted to do was get books out of that library, like volumes. I wanted them out, as many as we could. Because I made the argument, and it wasn't original to me, I made the argument that basically what we've got is a gigantic warehouse in the middle of campus. And that space is just too valuable. We're heating it, we're doing all this stuff, and it's just not being used. And a lot of these books haven't been taken out since the 1930s. And they're decoration, and we just can't afford that. So we need off-site and so on. So,
that would be hard for a lot of librarians.
Oddly enough, the librarians were among the first to sign on to this, because partly because in their community, they'd heard people like me before, and they were already getting out ahead of us, right? Trying to be at the front end of that kind of change. The people who struggled with it were the people who were very text-oriented in terms of their scholarly work. So, professors of history are not that keen on that. I think the College of Law, if you walk over there, will still have these stacks of books of articles or I don't know what the hell is in them. But they're good decoration. it makes it feel like you're in a law library, right? But truthfully, it's a waste of space. And anyway, to get the library where it is now, that basic bottom area and all of that, the strategy I used was, and I didn't, this again wasn't original to me, I learned this from the University of Guelph, get the students on site. Ask the students what they want. Reason, like students will opinion, and I know this will sound difficult for you to imagine this, but it's true. Student opinion on certain things will trump just about anybody and anything. So if students say they want food in the library, they want casual spaces, they want study areas, they want Starbucks, they want it is very difficult for anybody to say, well, I don't give a shit what students want. We're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it the old way. Like I would dare somebody to say that out loud in public. They may say that to one another. But out loud in public, very difficult. And so if you're like me, and I wanted all those things to happen, I didn't say it. I wasn't the one who, I invited the students to offer their vision for the library of the future. Well, it was the immediate near future. And they did. And people sat and they listened. And we took it all on board. We said, well, we can't do everything that you want, but we can do, So so that was what I was going to say. As one other piece I wanted to mention is we borrowed the changes we made at the University of Saskatchewan. We borrowed heavily from other institutions, and I say that without the slightest bit of embarrassment. We took the whole concept of putting the student services together. We took that from Manitoba. We took that library concept straight from the University of Guelph. Anyway, we made a lot of changes based on what we saw elsewhere. And that was something that had never been done at the University of Saskatchewan before. It was all this culture of everything has got to be, from here. It's all got to be homegrown, or else it's really not us, right? And so I didn't make a big deal of where we got these ideas from at the time. In some cases, in some audiences, I did, but I didn't want to tell people, the changes we're making are a grab bag of things from all over. But I did want people to understand that other people are making changes, so we got to think about this. And besides, they're already ahead of us. They've already learned some lessons. We don't actually have to learn them. We can just learn directly from them. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to. Weird. I just wanted to. Sounds weird hearing my voice in echo. One of the things I have a question on is how much, like you were making all these structural changes. There's a cultural problem. There's a deep-rooted cultural problem. There is the issue of going to the deans and saying, hey, you're not performing your job. You're going to have to resign. You have 10 years to make those changes, and you're going to some of the problems directly and addressing them. So my question is, how much, and I think you alluded to this, you said, how much micromanagement do you have to do in a situation like this? Because sometimes I feel like when you're in a situation where things are not happening the way you want them to, there's a lot of structural, cultural issues that people aren't seeing that are inside. They're not seeing the changes that are needed outside. They're not following the trend that the world has gone already 365 degrees that way, and we're still in la-la land. How do we get everybody moving in the right direction? So there's a little bit of direction, leadership, but also a little bit of saying, you know what, you're not doing this right. So there's a little bit of micromanagement. A lot of leadership books don't talk about it. Say, a good leader never micromanages, but sometimes you have to. And I wonder whether you can talk about that balance.
Yeah, well, it's a really, really great question because meanwhile, while I'm articulating these visions and I'm imagining new organizations and new entities like this school and new ways of budgeting and allocating resources, suddenly I've got a problem in the math department, which I did, where half the math department doesn't want to talk to the other half and is now petitioning to join the computer science department. And so I could say, and I did, to the Dean of Arts and Science, your problem, right? You got to do something. But there was a sense in which they would not be satisfied with unless they really talked to the senior administration of the university to explain, and by this time, by the way, this is interesting, their troubles had kind of percolated to the point where the newspaper is now interested, and we've got alumni, because people are writing to alumni and graduates of various programs. The math department is dysfunctional, these people are behaving this way, or these people are leaving, the whole thing is going to hell. And so the senior administration I couldn't say, well, not my problem. So I did have to go and listen to figure out, what the hell is the problem here? I don't know anything really about, it was a math and statistics department. And when people tried to explain to me the problems, it really wasn't a problem of the algebraists versus the calculus people or anything like that. It was much more personality and people behaving badly, harassment of all kinds, bullying of all kinds, and some of it was fraudulent behavior on the part of faculty members who in this particular case, manufactured student evaluations that didn't really exist, put them on the website that were negative evaluations of one of this person's colleagues.
Wow.
Yeah. So that person, we did end up coming to an arrangement with, he left the university. But interestingly enough, and to your question, in order to get to that particular point with that particular person, did require the president of the university. So we had to become very well acquainted with exactly what the hell was going on, what they were doing, and so on. So we had to drill right down there to that one. That had become I just generally describe these things as kind of a corporate reputational issue. So while it may look like micromanagement, its implications were very big. So it was a small issue, and you'll all be familiar with these things. And these harassment issues seem to have this feature to them. There is an episode or a series of episodes. They don't culminate in anybody kind of being physically abused or something, but nonetheless, damage has been done. And then having to deal with the fallout from that damage and how you deal with that becomes the big problem. I mean, that continues to be a problem, the damage itself. But then how this is dealt with, how people are heard or not heard, this will tend to occupy senior executives to the point of distraction. Like, I sometimes think that's why we have presidents, so that they can spend their time kind of on that, because I didn't want to spend my time on those sorts of things. And that's why you have lawyers as part of the senior as well. I mean, when I first came here, I learned we had a lawyer on I thought, like, why do we need a lawyer? Well, see, that shows you how naive I was. And we needed not just one lawyer, we needed actually a whole firm of lawyers to deal with a whole bunch of problems. So yes, you do have to know when to turn to your lawyers, just to pick on that for a second. And don't try to become your own lawyer and figure out, get these people involved, get good advice, and allow people who really are experts to deal with some of these, HR as well. Like, I didn't have a lot of use for HR when I was at McMaster. My experience with them was, I didn't think they were adding very much. It's not my favorite part of the institution, even to this day. But I will admit that there are certain circumstances in some situations where you're far better off having an HR professional deal with it than a head of a department of some kind. Because those people, the latter group, are much more inclined to make mistakes that create even bigger problems for you. So this isn't a real answer. There are going to be times, and this is part where you have to set aside the bigger picture, the bigger policy questions, the big resource allocation issues, and deal with this thing right here, right now. Just don't find yourself doing that all the time. Like, if your day is full of that, one meeting after another, dealing with one problem child or one problem situation after another, first of all, you are going to burn out, and B, you're not going to be able to realize this larger. You're going to lose the discourse.
Sorry, so if I was to just follow up with another question, if it's not a reputational issue, what if it's just in your day-to-day as a provost, some of the things that you'll be working on with the deans, when it's that kind of an issue, you have to go in and make those changes.
Sometimes you do.
You do have to micromanage a little bit. You have to.
Sometimes you do, and I'll be honest with you, in some cases I should have micromanaged more. I mean, I said to the College of Medicine, and I don't mind telling you this, that it seemed to me that the University of Saskatchewan needed a comprehensive undergraduate program in health sciences, instead of all of these various programs in physiology, anatomy and cell biology, microbiology, you name it. We needed to put these resources together and create a single undergraduate program that we could literally kind of market across the country, because we have a medical school. And, there are 18 medical schools or 17 medical schools in the country, and only 90 universities or 90 higher education institutions. So we could, and I should have spent more time actually holding their feet to the fire or meeting with them on a regular basis to make sure they were making progress. Instead, I was content with the message that we're doing that. We'll do that. Yes, we're going to do that. You bet. We'll get right at that. So I thought, okay, fine, you get right at that. I'm going to get right at something else. That never happened. And to this day, we still don't have that program. Now, maybe in the last 6 or 8 months, they finally got something through. So I should have, you want to call it micromanagement, I should have been more hands-on than I was. And it's easy to look back and say that, and you'll have the same experience. You know, you should have done more of this, should have put more emphasis on that. It's not that I was just wasting my time doing other things. But if I was really serious and I really wanted that, it turned out that I was going to have to do more of it myself. I wanted to tell you, because it does fit with and I won't go on much longer, but I wanted to tell you that people talk about how you do consultation, right, inside all of this. And so I'm going to tell you something that's kind of that you'll kind of already know, and that is easier to say than do, and that is that you have to work at the broadest and most inclusive consultative process you can inside an institution like this one. It's not going to be necessary, and some of your readings last week's readings are aware that in some organizations it's quite okay and expected to have change delivered kind of top down with some signals that change is coming, get ready, and then it arrives. A new technology, a new organization, a new whatever. Inside universities, that is not going to work. The vision piece and so on is not going to come from the bottom up. So certain pieces of this puzzle have to come from the top. But in order to make all of the changes I talked about required consultation with affected parties. And you know, I gave a talk once about social capital, actually, because I'd come across this concept of social capital myself, and I kind of wanted to share it with the rest of the university community. And I basically wanted to beg people to try to understand that our future as a successful institution depended to a large degree on our ability to generate social capital, not to use it up, because we're going to do that, but actually to generate it, to begin to trust one another more. Because I'd come into an environment in which everybody was sure that, well, I'm exaggerating here, but this is a message I would get. We're good. Our unit is good. In fact, we're probably great. The rest of this place is crap. Yeah? All these people, they don't know what they're doing, and people would have particular units that were their favorite units that were basically a waste of time and space, right? That program review was useful because it helped correct some of those impressions. But the bigger problem wasn't so much how people felt about others, but it was how they felt about themselves. They had typically very high opinions of themselves and how they were doing relative to everybody else. And I sometimes had to tell them. I mean, I said to the College of Arts and Science at one point, well, you know what? I know you guys think you're so hot relative, say, to the University of Regina, but I just looked at the numbers in terms of research revenue generated by the College of Arts, whatever they call it, at the University of Regina, and the arts units at the University of Saskatchewan, and they're basically the same. There's really, in other words, nothing to distinguish you, even though we're supposed to be at this big research-intensive university. So, you know, data, evidence, as Mr. Cohen showed us yesterday, makes a difference. You know, if you can actually produce a piece of evidence that, and this shocks people when they hear that. Typically, I don't believe it. You know, I don't believe that. You must be reading it incorrectly. Well, go and take a look. Go and take a look, and if you think I'm wrong, you know, be in touch. So I'm still waiting for somebody to come and contradict me. So you do have to sometimes confront people with the evidence. But you're doing this in a process of consultation, like you are talking to them. This isn't a nasty exchange, right? It's more a kind of, in that case, it was more a lament. You know, and I wasn't pointing fingers. I wasn't saying you people are, although some people probably thought I was. But we we could do more of that kind of soul-searching and honest conversation with one another if people trust that what you're doing is for the good of the whole institution. And I said I was going to say something about the leadership, and I need to just say that the president of the university at the time I was the provost was a master at providing opportunities for people and providing support for them. And to your point about micromanagement, he wasn't a micromanager at all. He would take up a case if he needed it, and he would, because he's a lawyer, so he would drill down and get into the particulars. But his strength and the reason why that building over there is named after him is really that he was able to provide other people with opportunities to succeed and to do as well as they possibly could. And he was unstinting in his support. He also was an excellent judge of who could do what. So he didn't ask people to do things that they really were not capable of doing. He praised people for what they did publicly. He singled out various people and said, they made a critical contribution to where we are now on various things. And he did all of this without, I never ever saw him really try to reflect attention back to himself. He didn't have to, because people were enormously loyal and they were more than happy to say very positive things about him. So, I read the Malloy piece, which was very good, by the way, if you had a chance to look at it. It's a little abstract, as I said to Janice, but it does sketch out this two kind of bases of trust, one based on contract and one based on this sense of, I'll call it social capital, where it's all about norms and expectations and relationships, not about contracts and monitoring and metrics so much. And I'm kind of skirting over some of the key differences. But at the university, and most of the world that you live in, it's not a case of one or the other. I had an employment contract. Everybody did. The president of the university had an employment contract. There were written expectations. In fact, if we didn't actually write down the job descriptions and things like that, we would have been falling over one another. And so you do need that kind of contractual basis. Not so for Hardin. For Hardin, he likes to emphasize that these kind of contractual arrangements allow for a permissible scope for distrust, where the contract kind of presumes, and I think in the case of collective agreements, there's a lot of distrust built in. And if you have a contract, like a collective agreement, you allow people to distrust one another. You set up grievance procedures and things like that, which are kind of premised on a distrust model. If we ran the whole university like that, we would be like nowhere. We wouldn't get anywhere. We wouldn't go anywhere. We wouldn't trust one another. We wouldn't like one another. We'd hate to come to work all the time. So the environment that I worked in, and the one that I was much happier about, was the much more collegial environment in which we supported one another. And that would not have been so simple if I thought that, for example, the president was picked favorites, or was willing to blame other people for his shortcomings, or was unwilling to be generous and appropriate in praising people for the work they did. If you don't have those things, your social capital level drops like this, and you might as well have contracts. You might as well build everything on the basis of distrust. But you also aren't going to have a very healthy organization. So I'm quite content with Hardin's idea about contracts, and I'm fine with making sure we understand one another, and this is a way of doing that. But it can't be everything if you expect to make the kind of changes that I've been talking about. I did have people tell me from certain quarters of the university that I wasn't allowed to do things because of the University Act. They were reading the University Act in ways that were highly favorable to the status quo, like doing nothing, or to hamstringing everybody so that nobody was really allowed to do it. And if you read the University of Saskatchewan Act, there are places in the Act that says, oh, you know, Jen is responsible for such and such. And Yevgeny is responsible for such and such, pretty much the same thing. And the vice president is also responsible for, and you read it and you think, well, you know, they're all responsible for the same thing. So the Act is not a beautiful piece of contract work. But, and this is a lesson I learned too, and so I'll pass it on to you. And when you go into an organization, see if you can find the foundational documents of the organization. Like whatever the hell is written down that says, in our case, the University of Saskatchewan Act, read it, you know? Or whatever it is that creates your organization, or whatever big piece of documentation governs, like in the, you know, for most people working in the finance area, most of these provinces and the federal government, for example, have financial administration acts, and those stipulate who gets to do what, when, and so on, the various roles of various people. Don't ignore those. Those are foundational, very, very useful information to have. But don't be citing these to people as reasons for why we have to do things a certain way. And, you know, in other words, try to avoid being rule-bound, but understand what the parameters are. And nobody likes to be told that because of some, you know, section such and such and such and such, where there's this clause and so on, that means that you can't do something which is demonstrably positive for everybody. Now, it could be that, by the way, that's true, and you have to deal with it. But I've seen too many people decide that they're mostly satisfied with explaining to you why you can't do something, as opposed to, okay, how are we going to do what we need to do in spite of this? Or like, oh, what do we have to do? Do we have to change this? Or is there a workaround? What the hell do we have? You know, in other words, problem solving. It builds trust, right? I mean, you know, you can get a lawyer who will tell you all the things you can't do or can do. But you need your colleagues to sit down and work with you as to how you're going to solve a problem. Anyway, I think I should stop. I mean, I've covered quite a bit of territory, and I did try to fit in some of the work that you're going to talk about now. I read the Bear piece. I thought that was an interesting piece, trust and antitrust. But I'm certainly I'm less confident talking about those topics and more confident talking about my experience. And I guess I hope I've shared some of the, you know, frankly, I wish somebody had told me some of these things before I actually took on the job. But then I probably would have really had to learn them for myself anyway, in one form or another.
So yeah, I have a question related to that. I'm wondering how much leadership can be learned from texts and books and manuals and the stuff that you find in airports, and how much you just have to, each person has to learn for her or himself.
Yeah, so I'll pick the middle ground here and say, you know, some people say, well, leadership is kind of, you're sort of a born leader, and other people say, well, you can really acquire the skills necessary. And again, I mean, like Harry Truman is often pointed to as a president who nobody could imagine kind of being the head of the Boy Scout troop, right? And yet he ends up as the president of the United States. And it turns out he has some vision as well, and some guts and strength, and all of the things that, well, some of the things that are on a list of leadership qualities. And so it's you know, I would not have been, I think I was answering your question about, I had some of the personal qualities, I think, and some of the interpersonal skills necessary to talk to people and have constructive conversations. but I was pretty naive about a lot of things. And I was off in my estimation of what was going to be easy and what was going to be difficult. And I would be lying to you if I didn't say that I was better at the end of my time as a senior than I was at the beginning, because I certainly was. I wasn't going to waste time on a lot of things. I was more focused. I had a better sense of priorities. I knew what resonated with people and what didn't and all those, and that was all the product of experience. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that just anybody can take on these roles. I wanted to say, and I hope you don't mind, but this is something that I wanted to end on, and it does deal with the leadership thing. And I just wanted to say that, like, leadership, management, and entrepreneurship, these are really fundamentally, I shouldn't say fundamentally different, I was going to say that, but these are different. So leadership in action is all about influence, and leaders influence other people. Sometimes they have the resources and the authority that comes with that, not always. So I said this before, like, there are people who are leaders within this institution, within this school probably, who don't have any real positions of authority. They just are people you listen to because they have good judgment, they've shown good judgment in the past. And that just is, these are leadership qualities. Stanley Fish once said that, in any university there are 50 people who can basically make things happen or not happen, end the career of senior administrators, make programs. And, I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out who those 50 people were at the University of Saskatchewan, but he was basically right. And most of those people did not have any formal position. Good managers know what to do with a set of tasks and a relatively stable situation. Good leaders create those situations. Mostly by showing others kind of the way forward and all the changes that are required. And again, you can do that from anywhere in the organization. And entrepreneurship is good to have. I have seen a lot of entrepreneurs inside universities that aren't really very good leaders. I mean, they're great ideas people, but the problem is they can't bring anybody else with them. I've talked to a number of deans over the years, and I've said to them, I can see where you're going, and I like where you're going, but I can't see anybody following you. I don't see anybody resonating to your message. Where's your team? Where's your, who's going to do what to make this happen? Entrepreneurs tend to be lone wolves. They tend to want to do everything themselves. And they sometimes will husband information and knowledge and keep it to themselves and kind of spring it on you. Right? And oftentimes, as often as not, they've already made commitments that you may not be entirely comfortable with. But because, they're bringing home this big prize of one kind or another, they want and expect to be congratulated for doing that. So entrepreneurs, every institution has to have them. Leaders, I'm not saying that you can't have a good leader who's also an entrepreneur. I'm sure that's the case. But I have actually seen more of the opposite. More entrepreneurs that actually don't have the requisite leadership skills to make anything really happen. So I did want to talk about that, and I just wanted to say, again, finally, and I've mentioned this a number of times, that we tend to overestimate the influence and authority that positions bring. Like if you're the provost of the University of Saskatchewan, you're some big shot who can do all kinds of stuff. Well, it turns out you can't do very much, and you certainly can't do anything really on your own. And it turns out as well that there are other people in the institution who are probably able to make some things happen way more than you can. Things you'd love to happen. So, and this will happen in any organization. So I was told, and it took me a while to learn that lesson. The president of another university said to me, Michael, you need to have a vision for my department or something. I said, vision? It's a department of political science. What kind of vision do you want? I said, no, leaders have vision, and you need to be a leader. I said, well, I was defining myself more as a good manager. I was and I was a good manager. But what he was really saying to me is, you will never become a president, blah, blah, whatever. You will never occupy a senior executive office if you are content with making sure that all the classes are being taught by the right people at the right time, and so on and so forth. As important as that is. So leadership is about, I can't, I don't know what makes a good leader, as I said, but certainly keeping your eye on the horizon, looking forward, talking about what it is we need to accomplish together. That's the kind of discourse leaders use. And I'm kind of chagrined to tell you that when I was a department head, and I was a department head for 6 years, I don't think I ever used that kind of language with my colleagues.
Vision.
It was mostly, we are great. They don't really understand how great we are. I'm trying to figure out how to get more resources to do this and to do that. Better space, better this. I'm going to problem solve at the local kind of level, but I didn't talk very much.
Is that because you thought that that's what they wanted to hear? That was a way of encouraging them?
No, I think it was. I think it was what I kind of thought the job really required at its core. And to be fair to me, it did require that. Like, I mean, if I was a guy who kind of went in the office and read up all of these, stories about where universities were going and all of that stuff, I don't think my colleagues would necessarily have appreciated the insight. They wanted somebody who was going to take care of them and take care of their problems and pat them on the back and tell them they were all great, right? And so it did take me some time to understand that I had to transcend that, as important as it was, if I was ever going to aspire to a leadership position. And I was going to need the trust of a lot of people. And people were very generous with their trust, notwithstanding the fact that I didn't show a lot of smarts with respect to what leaders need to do. I think some people must have seen or said to me, you have what it takes. You just aren't using it. You just aren't thinking in these terms. Your categories and your focus and your priorities are not those of a leader. They're those of a competent manager.
So a question about this class then, ethical leadership and democracy and public service. I think I'm probably not alone, when we read the title of this course, we think of leadership in terms of people occupying positions at a high level, sort of having that recognized power and authority. But one of the things we've talked about a little bit in this class is that leadership can happen at all levels. And you've even just said that leadership, if that's influence, is that the same thing? That happens at any level of the organization, and you don't have to be occupying any particular position.
But when you think about leadership, I defy you to find a way of describing it, and there are many, many ways, that doesn't in the end involve some kind of influence.
Right. An
ability to influence by example. People talk about moral leadership. Well, moral leadership, you can talk all you want. You really have to be seen to be doing something that has integrity at its core, that is an action and behavior that could potentially be or is actually harmful to your own personal interests, but you're doing it anyway. I mean, when you see people doing that, and you have to see them do that, not just say they actually, then you're talking about, then you will see that will influence other people. And I guess that's what I'm saying, Jen, is that in the end, I think, however you define leadership, influence has to be in there somehow.
Yeah. So what's interesting in the literature all over, whether it's biographies or films or TV shows, TV shows there might be more, strangely enough, more nuance in those, and especially all of the professional readings. Leadership is almost exclusively described as somebody who not only occupies a senior executive position, but I guess who occupies a senior position, right? Who has the authority to control and direct others. And so there aren't really those readings about this other kind of more subtle influence. There aren't a lot. There's not a lot. And whereas most of us going into whatever organizations that we go into, we may not all, and I don't know what the odds are, but It might be that only a tiny handful of people from this class end up occupying those senior positions. I don't know. Maybe because they went to the school, they all will. I don't know.
Yeah. So I guess I understand how you can be seduced into thinking that people who kind of give orders or commands and accept responsibility for outcomes, because I get that, are leaders, right?
Yeah.
But commands to do what? Orders to do what? You
Right.
know, I mean, the content of the action that is being advocated or displayed has to, people observing it have to start to make changes to their own calibrations about how they are going to behave.
Yeah.
Before you've got, in my view, before you've got leadership happening. You may have, let's make it, you may have formal leadership if you want, formal authority, but moral authority is going to come from leadership that is influential. And that, as I say, can come from just about anywhere
Yeah.
in an organization.
That's good.
Just one question.
Yeah.
So, based on your experience,
Could you speak
Yeah,
up a little bit?
you just have to
Sorry.
speak up a bit.
based on your experience, do you think leaders are born?
Yeah, no, I don't think leaders are born, no. Certainly there are some people who have some of those qualities and skills that are more, they demonstrate them early on, but those people are still learning as well, and some of them, I saw that Send Me Roger Stone, or Get Me Roger Stone. Have any of you seen that? Oh, Get Me Roger Stone. If you ever have a chance to look at it, it's actually quite an appalling thing. Roger Stone currently under indictment in the U.S. now for a variety of things. But here's a person who probably was a born leader in his own mind anyway. Certainly was influential, but not in a particularly positive way. And your bear reading, she starts out by talking about moral communities and moral leadership and, frankly, immoral leadership. I mean, there's a lot, and Mr. Stone would be a good example of the latter. Was he a born leader? Well, he certainly looked like somebody who kind of was hatched from somewhere. I mean, he's so full of self-confidence and brash, uninhibited, socially uninhibited, and in a way that really served his purpose very well early on. And he learned a lot, I'm sure, along the way. So, to your point, I mean, there are some people who are going to be drawn to leadership and be seen to be leaders. And so I'm not saying that and they have kind of in nascent form some of the qualities. But I would describe myself, for example, as an introvert. Like I never really enjoyed a lot of interaction with people, notwithstanding I enjoy interaction with you, but because we are part of a community, we share certain things. I prefer anonymity myself. I can perform very well at a podium, but I was never really cut out to be a university president, for example, a person who was going to have to be on talking to people all the time. And so to your point about qualities, I had a certain set of qualities that were good for a certain set of things, certain kind of leaderships, and probably a certain situation. I would never have been as successful as I think I was, and I had my successes here, if I didn't have a president of the university who was a complete complement to me. So we were really perfect for one another. So I would have been content to be a university professor the rest of my life. And I still enjoy it. Probably when I think back on it, it's probably the most satisfying part of my whole career was teaching and research and colleagues and stuff, and not being. So I probably wasn't born to do it. I probably wasn't as well naturally situated. But I had some of the qualities, and frankly, I'll be honest with you, I mean, in a university environment, as many, is full of intelligent, sometimes brilliant people, the number of people who are actually capable of leading, there are people who are influencers that can't follow through and can't do the rest of it. I would say it is a tiny fraction of people. That's why we have to go out. And we go through leaders. Like I just got a message today. The dean of nursing has resigned. All right. Well, I happen to have recruited the dean of nursing, this dean, and I feel very badly for her. And it's a very tough situation. And I'm sorry that this is happening. The thing is that finding people who can lead in organizations like this is difficult. And it's because these are not easy organizations to run. And the pool of talent, which is typically the professoriate, is not full of people who are really good at, frankly, sometimes interacting with other people. Mm-hmm. I mean, they spend their times in labs, they spend their times in libraries, in archives or in archaeological sites or wherever. They're into what they're into.
Right.
Sorry, you were going to say.
So, going with what you just said, would you think that? Thank you. Thanks. When people are, doing any sort of professional course that they're doing, should a sort of a course on leadership or team building be a part of every sort of a professional or any other course that you're doing, not just professional, but would that help people explore if people are not born, even I believe people are not born leaders, you develop on certain aspects of your personality and you work on them. But then sometimes those things are taught you in school, sometimes you get to explore them when you're in your further in your studies. But would a certain sort of course or a program help people understand that they do have leadership qualities and help them making those kind of decisions when they encounter those decisions, or no?
So we run. I've been part the last several years. Not going to do it anymore. But I was part of running a program for senior administrators across the country. Right, they would all come together, and we had a week-long intensive program for them. And they, I'd like to think that all the topics we touched on. Many of those topics were just about what you need to know for the job right now. You need to know the budget models that are coming, and you need to know the strengths and weaknesses of different kinds of models and what other places are doing. And so it's kind of quite a bit of information. But there was a component about, typically it's about how to resolve situations, how to, this does sound a little bit like coaching and micromanagement. But as I said before, some of these things are unavoidable. And sometimes leaders run into the biggest problems because they may have lots of skills in terms of writing documents and making proposals and persuading, managing up, but real problem in talking with their peers and getting along with other people and not be browbeating them and things like that. So can we teach that? I don't know. I mean, you can caution people. You can say, whether you know it or not, you're coming across as a bit of a bully. And you can talk to them about that. But it's pretty hard generically to say, here's a list of things you want to be if you're a dean, and one of them is don't be a bully. I mean, in some ways, you have to kind of learn on the job. You have to be coached, which is one of the reasons, by the way, there's a lot of coaching going on. Most of these deans here and in other places and other executives have coaches. When we hired this new president, one of the main things and I was part of the transition for him, I was told I had to make sure that he had a coach. It wasn't going to be me, but he had a coach of some kind. And that now has become a kind of sort of a requirement. So that this is a little bit to make sure that, well, first of all, for the person's mental health, important. So the person doesn't become despondent and so on. And there have been university presidents who've literally just gone into their offices and never come out. So that, and also just to make sure that there's somebody they can talk to about problems they're having with immediate staff or what have you. So that they get some cautions about and some help in terms of doing what they should be doing. But none of this sounds like leadership with a capital L. No. So I don't think I could imagine being part of a school for leaders in which I said to them, okay, here are the here are the things that will make you a good leader, and if you do all these things, success is yours. It's so contextual, so connected to personalities, and frankly, so ambiguous. Again, you read those articles and some of these articles we've got, but the stuff particularly in books that you can buy, popular books on, and that's a way to make money, by the way, is write a book on leadership of some kind. And, they all tend to say the same sort of things, and they tend to tell you to do things that it is very difficult for you to do if you don't have a predisposition to do them, is my view. That's one of the reasons I don't pay a lot of attention to them. Well, this has been fun. I think that dinging there is my parking or something. I'm probably getting a ticket.
You have another appointment.
I don't have another. I have to go and get my son, who's coming in from Toronto. So I'm hoping that his plane's on time. I'm going to go and find out. But I wish I could stay for more of this. But I've appreciated the time you've given me to kind of share my experience. It's been a long time now since I was in this role, the role I've been describing. But every time I go back to it, I feel like it's like just yesterday. So
A little bit of PTSD.
yeah, probably. Yeah, that's an excellent way of putting it. So thank you very much for the chance.
Thank you so much. Well, there. How about we take a 5-minute break, I think. Does that sound good? Yeah? Our regular 5-minute break that ends up in 7 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you told me. That's why I thought you were giving it ahead of time. You done it before.
Yeah. What I want you to do is to draw from the readings that we've done. So not every single reading, obviously, but a good chunk of the email that we talked about and our class conversations to look at your case, whatever story that you're in, isolate 1 to 3 kind of key ethical situations that somebody. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So just look at one. Yeah. So it depends what you're reading or watching for this case. Okay. So just what are if you're looking at a situation where the leader has either successfully has been either successful or unsuccessful in an aspect of ethical leadership. So they either, led people but in an unethical way, or maybe made a decision they thought was ethical and turned out to be really unethical, or made a very ethical decision that was very difficult to make. Draw from our readings to analyze that situation. And so what I'm looking for is that you can take the ideas from readings and apply them to another situation. Right? That you can take the ideas and concepts from the readings and look at a case study and say, oh, this is where I see this idea operating. Here's ethical blindness, or here is successfully leading a small group through transformational leadership, or here is some of the weaknesses of I don't know, it's up to you. It depends on the situation, but just draw from and then do a really good job of showing that you fully understand the concepts. So it's not enough just to cite it, just to say, oh, this is an example of this, and then leave it at that. You have to explain why and really unpack it. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I got your email. You got it over. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh, for a brand new baby. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I fully understand. Yeah. So just for today. Yeah. We're gonna just have a
Angel.
I know, yeah.
So some people don't have the right to talk against somebody.
Exactly.
So in that situation, so if I am talented, if someone talented, just be a good leader, but there is something biasness, there is something that violence over here. So my question is, how can you do a person, the normal person is not like not kind of person, the normal person. How can normal person can be a leader? So what
In a corrupt system, how do you, that's a really, really good question. You know, yeah, no, that's a really good question. We should try to find a biography or a Okay. Okay. So what I would do is if you can find something that is the story of somebody trying to be a leader in a corrupt situation. So let me think about it. If you have to leave right away, I can send you an email, but I will do a round table. That's going to be back in the city for those ideas. But where a story of someone who has been able to be a leader in a corrupt situation, that would be a really interesting thing to study. I would look at. I wonder if I can easily draw up my suggestions. So there is one.
So basically,
I know. Yeah.
Always there is some values over there. If you like, no, this is wrong. So you think that you talk about that. In that stage, if you talk, so you can be more. Because all of my what side is this? But those who probably always people, those bigger, more they can do this. Make a business from, but also don't be some other way whole family. But the thing is that after some time that you think that I should speak, I should have to speak about that, but this not that's also the government is great. Also I have to talk about that, so you know the issue of one of the problems after one of the
Oh my goodness.
so that is the fact.
Yeah, it happens. No, I've read about that. I know that happens.
That is a good thing. Always.
Yeah, I know.
When students, good students want to go.
I know. And you want to go back. I wonder if there's a biography of somebody, let's say, in Nigeria. And you know what? You may not find. You may not find. I'm just sending you. I'm just Googling. You may change some of our things. So we can start to find this one. Just to get ideas, but I think I'll ask the classes if you have any good examples. And my guess is that the best we might be able to do is to find biographies that where people try to be useful or something like that. But at least that you can analyze that. And then you can sort of see what happens. But I've talked to Michael actually about how I think this class needs to be restructured because the majority of students in this class come from places that are very and so we're teaching tools for working in some place like Canada. Yeah. Yeah. I know. So no, I think we need to adapt our. I know. I think we need to adapt our curriculum a bit to fit that context of our interventions. So, so I just sent you a few things you can look at, but if you want to stay for 10 or 15 minutes, we'll just go around the table maybe and see if anyone has any ideas for biography. Well, 10 minutes, or you can go and I will get ideas and I'll just email them to you. Okay, I'm going to grab some coffee and some water. Yeah, no, don't worry, don't apologize. It's fine.
So when we meet in class, we'll just decide. You'll start with early so that you don't have to. 4 o'clock will go back. I think 4 o'clock is your 3 to 4. 3 to 4?
I'll bring my son with me.
Okay. So it will be done by 4 o'clock. I will try to get that.
So next Friday.
Okay.
We'll meet.
Okay. Thank you.
Have you ever done it? Or you just have you ever done before? It's case studies?
Yeah, we've done. Because we did one for the class, right? It's a similar format to that.
For which one?
For our presentations, the case studies, the ones that we're doing.
You mean like, but in your experience, like before?
Yeah, we've done.
Yeah.
I think it should be okay. I think it's similar format to the presentations that we've been doing also.
Okay. So basically, it's kind of like just 4 slides, get my attention, and this slide, attention to what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Should be okay.
It's actually, we have a very interesting case study. I didn't watch, but I read
The abstract.
articles.
Yeah.
Basically,
It should be an interesting one.
it should be, yeah.
Because it'll summarize a lot of articles, so we'll have to.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to spend some time on it. 21st March is due, right?
Are you taking finance class? Public finance? No, you take it.
It was. I'm good at the part of economics.
Oh, because
Yeah, the part of the public.
Yeah, I think.
quite interesting. I was confused about the questions too.
It's like proposing things to the public sector. It's like
It's not easy.
I was trying to earn money and increase profit, but for the private sector.
So you did calculation.
So you like the business side of it? You're doing an MBA, right? You're doing an MBA, right? How long?
I'm always trying to get money from people, not to give money to them.
What is the name?
Master.
Business.
Business. Ah, okay.
All right, I'm gonna grab my coffee and then I gotta introduce you because he's got his son the same age. Right? Yeah, he's just I love him here. Yeah, he's just great. Yeah, we took all of our classes together. We did econ together, so we're bonded for life. Yeah, so. And they all walk with each other. Yeah. Sorry, that's the lady.
he's going to be an expert at case studies. You'll be an expert at case studies. Because they do a lot in business. I remember way back when in undergrad I did a case study. So you might have a lot of more experience.
Oh, actually, yes, it's about
Business, yeah. So he'll be a better expert than me.
But we should think about the ethical side, I think, right?
Yeah. No, I mean in terms of
But
the case study
it's always
structure.
good to know it.
Yeah, the structure and all that.
Like,
some group exercises this afternoon, but two or three things. The first two are related. I did talk with Michael last week when we were preparing for this class about the last class I was seized at some point with the realization or the thought that maybe our readings were quite, as I mentioned, irrelevant for a lot of students in this class who come from very corrupt countries. And I thought, how could we make this better, right? How could we do this? And I don't know if we can shift a lot of our readings this semester, but I might try. I just found a few to send to Mahib on ethical leadership in corrupt contexts. How do you do that? Without getting killed. But I did talk to Michael about it too, and I think that this warrants a bigger discussion in the school. That now that we have so many, our international students are the majority, and frankly, the majority of our international students come from places that have high levels of corruption. And so, if the idea for even half the students is to go back to those countries to work, then we need to incorporate readings that are more relevant and not kind of wear such rose-colored glasses about what public service work is like. Even as we're seeing now in the Canadian context, there's corruption as well, and all kinds of things that lead to unethical decisions. That said, I'm not sure how we're going to deal with it for the rest of this class, and we may not get there. It may be that you guys are a test group where we get suggestions and feedback on what. We'll do a more rigorous sort of feedback at the end of this class to go, how could this be more useful to you? I was heartened by Michael's talk today. He could have just stayed for 3 hours and I would have been happy to listen to his stories. But just the idea that, a lot of, him saying that we come out on the other end of this class not having any clear definitions and knowing that everything is contextual, it kind of confirms what I thought in the beginning of the year, where I said we're going to be in the gray. There's going to be very little black and white, and that's just where we have to start getting really comfortable with that. Mahib had a great question about how to be an ethical leader in a corrupt situation, even if the place is legally democratic. And what we're looking for now is ideas, if anyone knows of any good biographies or novels, I suppose, that would be dealing with cases of leadership, ethical leadership in corrupt places, even if it turns out badly for that leader, which it so often does. But if we're just looking for suggestions for Mahib's case analysis. If anyone knows of any books. Does anyone know any? Think of an example.
I don't know if any book is such, but you can check a book on the biography. I don't think he's written an autobiography, but it's on the ex-Prime Minister of India.
Dr. Manmohan Singh. He's widely respected as one of the best finance ministers India has ever had. And then he went on to serve 2 consecutive terms as prime minister. Not the most popular, or not the most. He's not considered apt either. He faced a lot of other issues. He personally himself was quite ethical. His environment wasn't that great, and he faced a lot of problems during those 2 terms that he served as a prime minister. And mind you, when you read about him, you're going to read a lot of criticism as well as a lot of praise for that man.
And is there an actual biography? Or
I can look into it. I don't think there's an autobiography. I don't think he's written one, but I'm sure people have written about him.
There was one biography of an Indian public servant that I sent out on our original list.
By Chaudhary?
Maybe.
Yeah.
But there was also one biography by was a former Minister of Finance of Nigeria. Woman. That was very good.
Okay.
Yeah, concerning the corruption.
I thought Nigeria would be a good source. Yeah.
It's very good, and you can also watch on YouTube. She was interviewed with the lady, the minister was interviewed.
And that was on our list, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good.
So I have one more question, like that some leader have they get the quality from their by one, and also there are some training and some kind of session they can know how to be a good leader. But my question is like, if you are coming from a corporate country, like it is democratic, but how can you improve yourself to be a good leader? What kind of things you have to learn?
Yeah.
To be a good leader, because you have a lot of bindings and a lot of biasness to impose anything in your country.
So the one Nigerian will help you.
Okay.
So let's go back to I posted them. They're in our pause. The recommended list of biographies. You'll find
Because it's explain how the former minister survived in a pool of corruption. Like the whole office was corruption, but she managed to come out, with good traits and
So that's a good one for you. And you can probably order it off of Amazon. I think I tried to make sure most of the books were findable. Yeah.
And there's one book on Manmohan Singh. It's called The Accidental Prime Minister.
Yeah, there's a movie out too about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the movie's trash. Don't watch it.
Okay.
It's written by his former media advisor because Manmohan Singh was considered like a puppet prime minister. Still, a lot of people respect him a lot. Like people, when he says something, people really listen to him because they know he's not just any corrupt. He didn't indulge in any corruption or all that. Even I can say that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Although people that are very drawn to the big names, like there's a lot of study, a lot of people writing about Mandela and Margaret Thatcher.
Why don't you say something?
So for my own interests, I'd rather read something else, but it's up to you.
Some really good ones I've read about and actually heard from people are actually Holocaust survivors and the corrupt, even people within the community, with survival versus integrity and a variety of different forms of governing and different corrupt levels around that and how people have integrity when you're dealing with certain situations. I've actually found a lot of those stories really relevant to ethical leadership.
In fact, Schindler's List, like, there is a really good example of what you were saying.
Schindler's List.
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, it's amazing. I love it.
So I think just to try and stay more focused on what this course is supposed to be about, it would, if we can, it's not always possible, to try and find people who are working in the public service somehow in that context, because there are all these examples of being a leader without any position required. Can be like the Primo Levi's book about the Holocaust are amazing, but he was a prisoner. So that's such a different context for what this class is supposed to be about. I would think that there is lots to learn that you can apply to the public service, but there are particular constraints when you're an employee of a corrupt government, for example, right? So I don't know. I would try this Nigerian. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Thank you.
Let's go. Yeah. Okay.
I just have a question regarding this whole corruption thing.
Yeah.
As a society, I think a lot of developing countries have this notion that if if you fix the top, like say, so this, if you change the top guy and if he's not corrupt, everything will be fine. How do you feel about that line of reasoning? It's not true, right?
No, I think it's what Michael was talking about today, that when you have a situation of deep corruption, you need to make a cultural change. And when you're talking about a cultural, like he talked about how hard it was to make a cultural change within the university, right? And that wasn't about corruption, but it was less complicated than corruption. And yet it took 10, 15 years, and it's still not over. So to try and deal with an entire country, you're going to need, I would think, people operating at all levels.
Because even as a consumer, if police officer is not taking money from me, that's very actually furious, because now I can go to the court and pay the whole thing. So yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, I kind of criticize them all the time that they take bribery, but when I get caught crossing a red light, it's just easier for me to get rid of that situation right there, rather than going all the way to a police station, get my license back, and do the whole thing, even if I have to pay the same amount of money. So yeah, I totally get it. It's the cultural thing. It's just because you're like, oh, who's gonna go waste another day? Let's just settle it there. And that's almost our time. And that's what I think. Even as a general population, we criticize corruption in the system, but as of now, we can't survive with that. We are so used to that we feed on that.
It's so hard, isn't it? I don't know. Like
it's sometimes, you want to save yourself the hassle.
Sure.
Yeah. It's not like we haven't tried. I have tried to get things done the other way around, the right way, the ethical way in India. Not just in India, I try to get things done in the Indian embassy in UK, and oh my God, no. I had to find somebody who could help me out. I had to give money to somebody to help me out. Otherwise, it was just not getting done.
So I'll give you this very good example. So passport office, because there are so many terminals where you have to go. So there are two different options, right? So either you can go stand in a line, go one terminal to another, and at the end you do the whole thing. Or there are guys outside who basically fill out your forms. You give them money, and they take your documents. It goes through all, and you just go to the final one, and you just stand there, right? This process takes 15 minutes. Going through every process literally takes 7 hours. So sometimes you are just forced to do these things because you're like, okay, I'm not going to waste 7 hours. Yeah, I know it's bad. I'm paying them money. But these are the decisions you arrive at. And that's why throughout the class I say, it's easy in a class setting or in a literature setting saying, oh, I'll resign. If the situation arises like that, I'm not going to cry. But when you get into the specific situation, you somehow find justification for your acts. And once you find the justification, that becomes an art.
Right, and then at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily a slippery slope on the part of every individual. Like, you might make that choice to pay however much money to avoid spending 7 hours in line, but you wouldn't then also make the decision to, have these people taken care of, right? Like, I don't think it's a slippery slope, but there's a certain tolerance that people develop for a level of corruption that they're willing to participate in.
Yeah.
Right? So there's still a moral compass.
Oh yeah, exactly.
But it's, I actually think that probably if we're, and I know the vision for Johnson Shoyana is to increase its international outreach, and part of that's going to be through an online program that they're developing specifically for MPA students internationally. And I really do think that we need 2 courses. I think that it is important to have this ethical leadership class, and so you can get we can all kind of get a feel for the complications of acting ethically, even in a place like Canada, right? But also just things like working in small groups, which is what we're going to do this afternoon. Because I can't even imagine, this is what I thought about hard after last class, is that like this question that you have about how do you make change in a system like that. One individual can only do so much, but where you have some amount of power to make any change, maybe it is that working in small groups. So that if you can even manage to make a team around you where there is trust, in a public service where you can't trust anybody, maybe if you realize that you are committed to being in that public service for the long term instead of finding another job, that's the only way to start, is to just start in your immediate surroundings. I don't know. I really don't know. But I'm kind of thinking that we need this class, but we also need a whole other class just on corruption in the public service, and that's like an entire class devoted to that.
I think that's the case now in Mexico because the new president we have
says that, well, he wants to end with the corruption in Mexico. And he says that because he's not a corrupt person, that no one else.
He's not going to allow it.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
he's trying very, very hard, but I think that it's going to need a lot more than that because we have been told that in Mexico we are corrupt people because our nature, because it's a cultural thing. And he says, no, we are not. People in Mexico is good people and hardworking people. Well, that was at least a very good political speech. But I don't know if it's in the facts it's going to work. I don't think so.
Well, you know, at least the goal is there.
Yeah.
I think making something like that happen takes a long time. It's like looking at the legacy of the colonization of the residential school system here. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen only through goodwill. It doesn't happen through a single leader. It takes a long, long time. But if people on all levels don't start making efforts, it doesn't happen, right? So there's a role there for a leader to have vision, right? To articulate that vision and try and convince people of that need. But that leader himself or herself can't make it happen, right? They have to be inspiring. And so I think it does start also at the school level, which is what we're seeing here with reconciliation. You know, in some ways it's got to start with kids, and kids influence parents. I mean, that sounds really kind of Pollyanna-ish, very naive in a way, but there is some truth to that, I think. It's not the whole story, but there's some truth to it.
I was watching the news yesterday, and I was trying to understand.
Sorry.
And I started to think about Latin America and Brazil, and etc. And do you think sometimes it's impossible to escape from doing unethical decisions?
Yeah, I think so.
Like, let's say you are the president of this class. We are the parliament. You have like an important social background. You have the ideas. You have the plan. But we are all corrupt. We can easily hit you, and we are moved by bribes. The things sometimes we have to give bribes to government. The thing sometimes to do good things, you have to do like 5 steps back. Yesterday I was thinking about judo. I'm biased because I grew up in a very good country. So the Canadians, they are scared. Like for me, that problem is nothing in comparison.
Oh, I know. No, I'm well aware of that. Yeah.
Latin America.
Yeah.
But I'm not like defending corruption here. I was trying to put myself on president or prime minister's shoes, like not in Canada, but in a very good country. Because we are talking about corruption, right? Do you think sometimes we had to deal with this? How would you deal with that?
I think that there is a reason why truly virtuous people tend to be monks and hermits and people who live in isolation from others, right? That you can only achieve that kind of purity when you remove yourself.
I would encourage
A lot of complex
you to read like Lula da Silva biography.
That would be great.
I haven't read that.
Yeah.
But Lula is a good example.
Very good example. Yeah.
Because
Does everyone know who Lula da Silva is?
He changed the country.
He was the labor, he was indigenous, and or at least partly. And he was the president of Brazil for what, 10 years?
Yeah,
8 years, and from the Labor Party. And he was such a huge inspiration for the poor people of Brazil, of which there are.
Yeah. And around the world.
Yeah, around the world, yeah. And I had just finished my master's research in Brazil just before he was elected, so I paid very close attention to.
And he's in jail now for nothing.
Yeah.
For nothing, because he would win the elections again. So,
yeah.
But sometimes we have to do with that.
Yeah.
You know, we can't just ignore that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have plans. We have big goals. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard.
It's hard too.
It's really hard. Absolutely. Yeah.
So he decided to.
And I think
he decided to buy the parliament for a while.
Yeah, and it backfired.
To make changes. So,
yeah.
And he did. He changed the country. Actually, he changed like a big part of Latin America. But he didn't steal anything, but he had to do.
He had to make compromises. Yeah. No, and it back then now.
Like
and now look what's
probably.
happened. Right? So it's, I don't know what the answer is. But
Me neither.
Yeah. Yeah. So, any questions about the final essay assignment at this point? Pretty straightforward.
It's a lot of good material.
It's good. It's like it's got all the entire syllabus.
Yeah, even
is in this.
as soon as that started, like the whole. Her opening statement, like, oh boy.
I know, right?
Yeah, like, okay, put some popcorns now.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I thought she wouldn't do that, but no, she actually, just because she met with the party just a couple of days ago, so I thought, everything is good within their ranks.
And you're looking at that as full space of engagement now too, right?
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of things going on. It's really interesting. And it's challenging too because it keeps on going, and so it's still unfolding as you're writing. Yeah.
I actually couldn't catch what exactly did she say in the beginning. I know that she said that she's been pressured by the PMO. That's all I read.
So basically, not just one, different individuals at different point of time do the same thing that. So yeah.
Over.
It's a short clip, right?
Yeah.
Even if you just listen to the opening, it just gives you the whole context.
But she also talks about how she's a woman who speaks the truth, and she comes from a long line of matriarchs from the Longhouse, and she's like, it's powerful.
It is.
Yeah, so she's asserting her indigenous ethical framework into this conversation, which is one of the only times that this has happened at the federal level. When we've had very few instances of this being possible because we've had so few indigenous leaders in positions of.
She makes that very interesting comment that how they keep bringing about those job losses if the company decided to go away. And then she goes like, it was okay to bring it one time, but if you keep bringing it, then it was not okay, and it was conflict of interest, which for me was interesting. Yeah, you can mention it as a point, but you can't really stress on that.
Yeah. So if there's no other questions right now about the final assignment, then what I wanted to do this afternoon, we have 3:22. Oh my God. Okay. So we're going to do this really quickly. We're going to divide up. I've got a question. Who, based on what we've read so far, who here feels really confident that in a small group they could, be a good leader? And it's okay. It's not bragging or anything. It's just like, this is, where do you feel? Okay. That's it? One? People have had leadership positions here. Come on. Okay. So who, put up your hands. Who feels like that's something they feel pretty confident, like in a small group?
Confident, not comfortable.
Yeah, confident. It's not. It's okay. This is all just like. This isn't about false modesty, people, because it's just. So we got one. How many? 1, 2, 3. Really? That's it. Okay. Who feels like midway? Like maybe, but I'm unsure. I don't know. Come on, put your hands up so I can see them. Wow, we got so many shy people. Okay. Who feels like that they're really, this is new to them and they really don't feel like they have leadership experience or the whatever it takes to be a good leader, even in a small group? It's okay. 1?
Yeah, I personally, I feel there are a couple of things that really need to work before I can claim that I can be a leader in a small group, especially listening to disagreements when I kind of know in the back of my mind that this is not right. That's where the really bullish part of my me comes out, which I know, and I only realize it after like making my points that boy, no, I shouldn't be more.
Were you the president of the Pakistani?
No, I was not president. I was a treasurer. Yeah.
So it's a leadership.
Yeah, I was just a treasurer.
So who was that who said they felt not very confident in that position?
Nobody raised their hand.
No. So, I mean, you said, so who feels like really not confident to be in that position in a small group?
Like leadership, like a
leader? Yeah. You don't. Okay. Zeph, where do you fall on this? How about, okay, let's do this differently. On a scale from 1 to 5, in terms of your feeling that you can, do this leadership thing in a small group. I'm not saying be president of the university. Nobody here can do that right now. But in a small groups context, 1 to 5, 1 being like, since it's not something I'm comfortable with, I really normally don't take that role. It's not for me. I don't really know how to do it. I'd be nervous. That's 1. And then, yes, I can do it. I've done it lots of times in my work, whatever. I'm okay with that. That's 5. So I'm going to, Zeph, what number, where would you put yourself?
1 to 5.
4? Okay.
5.
5? Okay.
3.5.
Here we go.
If you talk about the ethical leadership, I would say 2.
2,
If
okay.
it's about something different, I would not specify, but it depends.
Unethical leadership, you're right up there.
When it's ethical,
Okay. Okay, so 2 is okay. 3, okay. 5. All right. 4. 3. 5.
depends what
2. Okay.
3.5.
3.5. Okay. 4. All right. So, how many people do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So, we're going to break into 4 little groups. They won't have the exact same numbers in them. And one group is going to go with Denise. One group's going to go with Irina. One group is going to go, who are my 3s? Juliana, Baba, both 3. One group's going to go with Juliana, and one group's going to go with Baba. And you guys are going to be the team leaders for this exercise. Okay? So,
You get an opportunity.
So we'll have Denise. So these you 3 together, right? I think we go. My math is really bad right now. Kaio, Baba, Caitlin, you 3 together. Juliana, and Omer, yeah, and we were at what, 3.4, okay, and then Zeph together. And then who do we have left? Everybody else together with Irina. Okay, so break into little groups, and we've got half
You guys are
down
coming
there.
here?
She's the leader, you're telling her.
And the team leaders get to lead everybody through this next exercise.
We can come to you.
Which?
We can come to you.
No, don't worry.
This was just more space.
Come. You're the leader.
What are we doing?
So, what is the
So
exercise?
I'll tell you what the exercise is. Who has handy, because I'm disorganized, who has handy the documents I sent out after last class? Remember we drew the thing on the board?
Oh, yeah.
We've got the keywords and the little map.
I have to put it up.
Somebody can pull that up for me, because I have it, obviously, but I just don't know where.
You just want the email?
Yeah, send me the email.
Okay.
That would be great.
We still looking for that, folks. I don't think Neuro has a group.
Oh, did you not get a group?
No.
What? Nuru doesn't, no, oh, Nuru. You go with them. Yeah, there we go.
Forward it to your email? To your email?
Did you forward it?
Yeah.
Excellent. So, so we have the list of, do you all have this, anyone have the list of keywords that we drew up? I will get it printed off. And each group will have a copy.
Yeah, we moved a bunch
And it's not coming through. There we go.
So
Okay.
the one that you
Yeah. There was a. Did I just send you a list of qualities? Is that it, or did I have a little map? We put
No,
trust
it's
at the
just a list.
center, right?
It's just a list, yeah.
Okay. So. We put here. We put trust. No, I sent you something else, and I had legitimacy. I added that in the center. Remember that? I sent another diagram. Pretty sure I did. So we're going to break this into 4 areas. And looking at certain qualities that we have sorry about this, guys. Okay. So let's look at this in terms of collaboration. I'm not spelling it right. That's one quality of leadership. Control of security, right? Let's look at, you can call this creation or innovation as a broad term. And then so competition might be the right word, but this is what I'm referring to here is something that acknowledges the democratic aspect of needing to meet a wide variety of different preferences, right? So we have this list of terms. I'm going to get Mandy to print out 4 copies. And based with this, using this diagram, I want you to try to figure out where each of the qualities, which box it fits into. And the team leaders are going to lead the group in trying to figure that out. Okay?
So the list we have, try to put that
To fit into here. Yeah.
in these 4 categories, right? Like 5.
Yeah. Yeah. So trust and legitimacy being at the center. So even Michael talked about that today, is that you have to create some sense of trust among people, the social capital. You have to generate it in order for any kind of changes to be made, right? That's part of leadership, is creating that trust. Looking at different areas, so these are just sort of broad areas of things that you need to do in the public service. You need to be responsible for collaboration amongst departments, amongst individuals, amongst institutions. Control and security, checks and balances on things, right? It could mean all kinds of things: creation, innovation, change. And then competition, which is this idea that you have multiple constituents and you've got to meet a variety of needs, right? So using this list, try to figure out where the different qualities fit. And the team leaders guide you through the process, okay?
What if they fit more than one category?
That's something that you need to discuss then. That's a good question. Yeah. And each of the groups is going to work on this, and you've got like 25 minutes. And I will...
So, no, but that's
From the email I sent on February 15th.
My question is, let's say, for our decision making for this process,
And I
are
will
we looking at efficiency as a
see if
criteria, or are we
Shannon-
looking at equity as a criteria, right? Because
Equity, fairness.
so
It's a good point. Where are we? I think we're looking at both, right? We're looking at equity and efficiency.
and we're looking for both. Okay. So I'm gonna shoot a question right at the back. So let's say when we talk about democracy in a group setting. So for example, what if as a leader you come to a different conclusion than the group, and then just for the sake of argument, you as a fact know that you're a conclusion. No, you're not wrong. Let's say you as a fact know that you're not wrong.
And your team is going the other way.
Is the other way, but let's say we did went the route of voting, and the other way. So that crowd.
That is where as a leader, even though you want to fulfill the democratic principle, you kind of stuck, right? Because you can't fulfill the democratic principle because you know. But this is where the democratic principle is to be followed in line with the mandate. What is your mandate as a team? This is what I've learned from my experience. So you asked this question in class, I think you want to know what the answer is. The answer is this is how somebody taught me this. They said, look, what is the mandate of your team? My mandate as a research team manager is to ensure that we get sufficient financial framework people identified for financial purposes. If they are giving me a recommendation, which kind of emphasizes, if they're giving me a recommendation to do something that is outside of that, democratic as it is, I can say, I appreciate everybody's feedback. I thank you for your participation in this. However, our mandate is this. I want to be democratic, but at the same time, we have to be practical in following the pursuit of the mandate that's been outlined by our union, by our. It goes back to the vision and all of that. So you would say that in that context. But you make a good point here that it would be very difficult to put it clearly.
Just to carry on this, right? So, yeah, which would
yeah. Let's look through the list and then we can talk about it because we only have 20 minutes.
We have to
assign it. Yeah.
Creation and innovation. Let's look at that then.
No, we can just pick from however you want to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, let's go and put it in the
Relationship building.
You want to look at the relationship or do you want to look at it? So the team prefers this way, or what do you prefer?
Okay, let's go one at a time.
No, what do you?
Yeah, I think that's the more efficient.
Efficient. Okay. Right.
So I think it should be in collaboration. Yeah. So relationship building.
Do you want us just to write it down, or just put it in that one?
Yeah, we'll just put it.
What you prefer in this team?
While we're doing this, let's say there are two projects, A and B, and let's just use one project A, but we have two options. Either we can do it in teams or we can do it in individuals. The output doesn't really change based on whether it's done individually or team. As a leader or as an individual, what's your preference? What's your go-to response? Would you pick where you have these individuals doing their stuff differently so you can question them, you can make them accountable, or you have a tendency to make teams, like in other words, my question is, if the output is same, would you prefer a team setting or would you prefer individual?
So
you would prefer team? You would prefer team? Yeah, personally, no. I really have the reason with that is if the only reason that I prefer teams over working individually is when I'm getting a greater output. Let's say in other words, if we talk about an economic sense, if I'm increasing the size of the pie, if I'm not increasing the size of the pie, then my go-to position is I'll rather do things at my point.
So from an individual perspective, that's okay. But in a group setting, you cannot, like I cannot tell, like say, that's a professor's project. You are going to do this project. And then if she doesn't do it, I can't go to Jen and say, hey, you know what, you didn't do it. That holds an individual responsibility. Sometimes people don't like that. depending on the team that you have, so you have to assess this with the team, and depending on the projects that you're working on. So for my team, I've noticed that individually holding somebody accountable doesn't go very well.
Doesn't go very well?
Doesn't go very well, but it depends on the situation. Who are you? Are you a leader or are you the employee?
So when you said it doesn't go very well, yes, from their perspective, but let's talk about...
But if a project requires independence, then yes, then you could use that approach. So good question.
There's a long list.
There's a long list. Yes, that's good.
Responsibility.
Responsibility. Is that under
control?
Control? Yeah.
Patience.
I like how we all agree.
I feel like we have a lot of patience.
Reliability.
Trust.
Even Michael saying that.
So I had tried to send you all the framework I drew at home, and I guess I just didn't attach it. Anyway, this I had did in my original sketch. I called this is another way of thinking about it, individual utility. Right? If that makes it easier to understand what I'm thinking about. You've got to in a democracy. You've got to meet the needs of lots of individuals that have their own ideas of what you need and their own preferences. Right? So there's competition amongst individuals, and you've got to kind of deal with that.
No, I still think it's control. Responsibility.
Meet needs of individuals.
So, for example,
because that responsibility is not the need of the individual. Basically, it's the need of the, let's say, group leader. He needs to find out.
Yeah, I was just thinking like daycares. If you offered only daycares to children until 5.
So
that's great to lead a lot of people, but then anyone that does shift work or things like that, they get left out.
This word explains it, I think, in a better way rather than individual. Democracy is like, how do you basically listen to all the people with different backgrounds and then come to not really unanimous, but come to an acceptable conclusion. So I think that's what it means by individual utility, when you look at different people and then kind of see what their background is or how they would accept. Yes, that's
so
what I
then
think.
responsibility wouldn't apply.
No, I think it still goes to control and security.
Okay.
I think that would be creation and innovation. That's what I think.
If you are passionate about something, is there like let's look at reference. We are thinking only one section. Could it apply to multiple sections?
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, passion. It's not collaboration, right? For sure, passion. Not control.
Not control.
Individual utility. Maybe individual utility. Like for example, if you're the team leader, if you think that certain individuals are more
passionate about something, you would
exactly, or you'll just kind of use them in a more productive way. If you, as a team lead, think that So
I wouldn't describe you as a tool, probably 4 or above. Because you have that, because that is a very important quality what you just mentioned. Because it might in my team somebody is passionate about something, and you say, I'm really wanting to do this.
I know, given the situation, that's the thing with, even though when I have to do something which doesn't, let's say, align directly with my philosophy, I don't have a problem doing that. I can do that very easily. I'm actually most of the time very flexible. When I go into my group assignments, I let people decide what time they want to meet, what time, because yeah, exactly. I just find it easier because I just give them the free Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever works for you. It's fine. Okay.
Accountability.
Well, control.
My security is dependent on accountability. Like if you're not accountable, then I'm not secure. Like my position isn't secure. If somebody is not accountable for these results, then I can get fired. If there's no accountability.
And plus, accountability you use as a tool to, let's say, even hold control in the group dynamics, right? Because that's the tool we're going to use.
Compassion. Yes, this is control. Yeah. Compatibility. What is the next one? Compassion.
I think it was probably compassion. Yeah, it's compassion.
Relationship building is, would it be under collaboration? Because if you have to have compassion in order to build relations, right?
Yeah. And at the same time, I think trust.
Yeah, is there trust mentioned?
No. What about, can we put compassion in trust or no?
Yeah.
Do you think compassion is a part of the whole trust building process?
How can you build relationship without trust? I'm just thinking collaboration. If there's no trust, if I don't trust you, I will not work in a project together. Right? Like if I feel like you are not going to help me in my project, I will say.
Like for example, if you take for example any one of those those meetings where you have this one person in the middle who runs around, the person needs to show that part of compassion so the group can develop that trustworthiness, right? If you look at the trust of a group setting, right?
What are you thinking? Are you thinking trust goes somewhere else? Is that why you're asking?
Yeah, that's what
Collaboration. Collaboration. Okay. So it goes.
We can put it on.
No, we are also saying.
No, we already wrote in compassion here, right? But we're just wondering if does this come here too? Trust.
Transparency.
Meet needs of individuals.
Yeah. Individual utility, empathy, right? Empathy is basically understanding how other people feel, right?
Collaboration.
Yeah, so that automatically covers, right?
Yeah, that's cool.
Participation, so that's collaboration. And then that's also innovation, because participation sometimes can lead to different or let's say new ways of doing things, which we can categorize as innovation or creation.
It's a bit of a stretch. Sure, we can put it in. It's a good thought. Let's just write it in front of us and we can revise it.
And then we'll also see how many we have under creation and innovation to begin with.
It's just an exercise because you're limiting yourself. If you're just looking at one block, you're limiting yourself.
Exactly.
Patient. Oh, man, that's a big one. Because I mean, patience.
So I think individual utility.
It's not control.
Individual utility.
Yeah, you have to. Does it meet the needs?
Because see, that's the thing about a leader, right? If you're a group leader, you can basically just shut anyone out. You need to be kind of all these three things. If you think about it, you need to be empathetic. You need to be patient. Even in your mind, when you think people are saying wrong things.
I think collaboration also
yes,
fall because if you are building a relationship with somebody and you are not patient because if you are slow in building your thoughts, some people take a long time to get to the point. And if you so what's your point? If you stop them, it becomes
innovation is already quality.
So that's control.
Quality. But what could it go under? Not really innovation, creation. I think this is okay. I think there is some relationship. Let's put it under there because if you want to produce a good quality. Yeah, use an extra. That's a good idea. We'll probably submit your list. That's control.
Let's go with your choice.
So that's collaboration.
I agree. This is a difficult one. Collaboration is one because you're empowering somebody else too. You're meeting the needs of individuals because you're saying, okay, you be part of the solution, you're not part of the problem. So you could empower people to help them solve it.
So we have it in collaboration
and individual utility.
How's it going?
I think so. Right, you guys agree? Does this make sense or am I making
No, actually,
yeah,
I think it makes sense. It makes sense, Because the whole process of letting other people speak stems from the empowerment,
meeting the needs,
right?
meeting the needs.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Equity. Where would equity go? Equity is being fair, correct? Equity is fairness.
Yes.
So if you're fair, you're meeting the needs of everybody. You're fair to everybody. So you're making sure.
In most of the practical setting, you pick equity against efficiency, right? So you say the more equitable you want to be, indirectly means the less efficient you will be. Like for example, take any of the social programs in Canada. They're based on equity, rather than
Than efficiency.
or equality, right? Like for example, a person who makes 12,000 doesn't pay any tax, and a person makes.
So would you say it's more of a meet the needs? What do you?
Yeah, I think equity should be
under trust.
Yeah.
I think so. I think you're right. And I think it could be under here too. Like it could go.
Trust.
I agree.
Because it makes sense individual utility, because sometimes you will treat those individual based on what their circumstances and situation is. Like, just to give you an example, if you know your team member had, let's say, 2 kids and they can do something at night, so exactly, so you wouldn't go like this, because every member has something to do at night, you should also have it, right? That's efficient probably, but not equitable. That's,
and trust would also be kind of, you can't have trust if you're not fair. If I'm fair to him, then it would show why you're fair to me. Okay? And what else? That's under legit. Where would that fall?
Trust.
Would you say moral compass is like this? I don't know, I'm just trying it out there. It's just outside of, we don't have to follow what she's written. Moral compass dictates all of this.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Actually, moral, because it's such a broad term.
It doesn't fit. I don't think it fits in any one of these. I think it's a whole, it's like a lens. That's what I'm saying. That doesn't follow the professor's model. We have a very good argument to say.
Can you make the statement morally, let's say a leader with a moral compass is more trustworthy and legitimate?
Yeah.
Or a better moral compass?
Where did you have
Those supposed to be like values.
All right. Moral compass.
If you look at it from a team leader perspective, I think individual utility, when you're looking at other people, and you're kind of
it doesn't fall under collaboration. Okay? It doesn't fall under control.
Not innovation.
No. So yeah, you're right. It actually shouldn't be there. It should just be there. Yeah, you're right.
Because I think this is the competition democracy.
Yeah. I think so.
What's the term? Can you repeat the
moral compass?
Moral compass doesn't necessarily make you collaborative. It doesn't necessarily make you have less or more control or whatever, or care about security. But what I was thinking is, it does, like, to have trust, to have legitimacy, you have to have a moral compass. And I wonder whether it's overarching, it's around the whole thing.
So what we can put on there is actually
it could also be.
I actually disagree with that. Yeah. The reason I would say is because when you talk about individual from a group perspective, right? So, so let's say I'm a group leader, and this section actually talks about the members of your groups, right? How my moral compass will improve, or let's say, of individuals, in the sense that what empowerment it is, because I'm empowering my team members, right? So I'm thinking that same thing, the net result will be positive. Then how can I make sure that my team members are their moral compass is right? Or is this something which I can put there?
You could ask there is that moral compass. Transparency.
Transparency is
control. Respect.
Trust.
What about collaboration? Can you put respect in collaboration or no?
Yeah, you could put it there, sure. You could put it, because if you don't respect another, it's a bit of stretch for sure. Social outcomes.
Social outcomes.
Meet the needs of individuals. Individual utility. I think it goes here. Love. Love is collaboration, trust.
So guys, we have about 3 minutes left, and then we'll wrap up.
Public good. Public good. Trust.
Yeah.
Co-production.
So respect.
Innovation.
Respect the leader.
Co-production?
Collaboration.
Co-production.
Yeah, makes sense.
Could also go into creation.
Flexible framing.
Flexible framing.
So I think it can go under two things, collaboration and individuality.
Flexible
framing.
What is flexible framing?
You have rigid framing where you make decisions. You have like rigid framing where you focus on one thing and you.
So individuality.
Yep.
Flexible framing.
Oh, there's some random, it's like collaboration.
Political.
We're better than others.
Trust.
Very.
Risk taking.
Innovation.
Innovation.
Efficiency. Efficiency.
Control.
Efficiency would be efficiency. Sure.
Because efficiency actually, this is something which you can evaluate, right? So let's say you can say that method A is a better way of doing these things because we produce 8 readings, and method B we can only produce 7. So you can use efficiency as a criteria to control.
Efficiency could also
Just
go
one
under
more
creation.
minute.
Compromise. That's relationship building, collaboration. You can't compromise. Yeah, relation, collaboration. Knowledge. Knowledge is innovation. You can't innovate without knowledge. Knowledge.
Resilience.
Relationship building, I say collaboration. Be resilient. Something goes wrong. It could also come under creation. You could put it here both here. Resilience is being able to, if there's a setback, being able to get out of it and continue to move on, even with a challenge. You could put under creation and collaboration.
Sacrifice.
Trust would be under. No. Sacrifice would be. Your sacrifice would be you sacrifice something, you're losing control. No, sacrifice could be collaboration. Yeah, collaboration. Partnership is collaboration. Consultation is collaboration. Open-minded could be collaboration and creation.
Yeah, and creation too. Yeah.
Because you have to be open-minded, creative.
Otherwise you don't innovate.
Democratic.
Critical thinking, innovation.
Critical thinking.
So guys, if we could wrap up.
Critical thinking.
We have just like the
Pragmatic.
tiniest amount of.
What is pragmatic? Pragmatic is.
What is pragmatic?
Impractical.
Impractical. Okay.
Hello?
Control.
Let's wrap up.
Okay, yeah. Pragmatic.
Okay.
Collaboration.
So here's your.
Control.
How will I do this then?
Utilities control.
We still doing. Vision is.
So when we come to class next week,
Creation.
we've got a guest speaker again, don't we? Our last guest speaker.
Mission as well.
So at the end of next week's class, then, what we will do is divvy up all the people who weren't here into each of these groups. You can finish up then. Okay? So we'll just save the homework for then. Okay. So there'll be homework attached to this, but not for this week. We'll be the same.
Sorry.
Not for marks or anything, just for fun. Next week we'll be not in this room. Next week we're going to be crammed into the into the Canada room because there's something else happening in here. Okay. So we'll be lined up in rows like with little students in the Canada room for next week. So I'll try to remember to put that out by email too. There's some event. I think the faculty are doing some strategic planning in this room next week for Johnson Cheyenne. So nothing except work on your assignments for next week, and then next week we will finish up. Even those people who think they're finished aren't finished yet, because you'll be getting new people to your group, and you're going to have to bring them on board and discuss where all these things go. And I will send out the little diagram by email. And that's it. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. This was fun.
Yeah.
If people need, is it true that we have both the ethical leadership thing and the journal for next week?
I think so, yeah.
So if you need an extension on the journal, take it. So for sure the assignment is due next week.
Wouldn't it make more sense for the other one?
Let's do it the other way around. Journal's due next week, and you have any time within the following week after that, up until the 14th.
13th.
Yeah, to get the assignment in.
Thank you.
Okay.
Assignment is by our.
So,
or whatever it happens to be.
We have to do this. Hey.
One at a time. One at a time. Okay. Yeah. Kyle. The assignment is the case analysis. Individual case analysis. You can hand it in any time between next class and the class after. Okay? Journals due next week.
Journals due next week?
Yeah. This is what I've been told, but is it?
It is,
yes. The journal I'm not grading. Remember? So until the end of the year.
End of the year? End of the
End of the semester. The year that's in my mind. Feels really long. Yeah. You know what that's Oh, good. Oh, okay, fun. Well, yeah, do that. Yeah, that's fine. You might, but that's okay. But no, you don't have to. This week, you do not have to do anything about this diagram in your journal. Write about whatever. If you want to write, just write about corruption, which everyone seems to want to talk about, just normal. Then you can write about that. Whatever you want. This diagram that we've been working on today, you don't need to deal with it in your journal at all right now. Okay? So, yeah. So don't worry about it. So just write whatever you want. Yeah.
Also, so for the assignment, you have from next class to the next class.
Yeah, so an extension of the assignment, and that's so because that involves actual reading or watching something. So if people need a bit more time to squeeze that in, they can take it. And that also gets graded. Whereas at this point, the journal is still just for feedback. Right?
So the journal is for the feedback.
The journal is for the feedback, and that's due next week, so I can not have everything coming in all at once. So the journal's due next week, and then you have a whole week extension on the assignment, which is the second and last individual case analysis. Yeah? Okay.
How about we tell the team which went only on the weekend? Right? Let us inform the whole of the week.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Not for us. Okay.
Then they'll get all shocked.
I guess what you want is a situation where people are...
Is this thing still recording?
I think so. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know how to turn it off. I'll tell Mandy. She knows, so. I didn't set it up.